The last thing Rowan Hale did before he died was reach for her hand. Maren had been sitting beside his bed for 3 days straight by then, her fingers raw from wringing out cold cloths, and her back aching from the wooden chair she'd dragged in from the kitchen. The old man's breathing had gone shallow sometime around midnight on the second night, each inhale longer than the last, each exhale quieter, as if he were slowly learning to let go of the air itself. She hadn't slept. Not really. She drifted in and out of something that wasn't sleep so much as a kind of suspended waiting, her body too exhausted to stay awake and too frightened to fully surrender to rest. Every time the room went quiet, she snapped back to alertness, heart hammering, eyes fixing on his chest to count the rise and fall. On the morning of the third day, just as the light outside was turning from gray to the pale gold of early October, Rowan's hand moved. It slid across the quilt toward her. Slowly, with enormous effort, the way a man might reach for something he was afraid would disappear before he got there. Maren took it. His fingers were cold, thinner than she remembered. He didn't say anything. He just held on for a moment, and then his grip went slack, and that was that. She sat there for a long time afterward, his hand still in hers, the morning light moving across the floor in slow degrees. Outside, Coldwater Creek went about its business. A wagon rolled past on the main road. She heard a dog bark twice and then fall silent. The world had not paused, not even slightly, and she found that deeply unkind. Rowan Hale had not been a man of large gestures or grand declarations. He'd been a leather worker, a craftsman who operated out of a single-room shop on the unfashionable western end of Coldwater Creek's main street, between a grain merchant who smelled permanently of dust and a seamstress who had stopped speaking to him sometime around 1871 over a disagreement involving a bridle. He'd taught himself everything he knew from a man named Elias, who taught himself from someone before that, and so on back through a chain of patient, anonymous hands that nobody had thought to record. When Maren came to live with him at the age of 7, her parents gone in the kind of quick, indifferent way that fever took people on the frontier without warning or sufficient reason, he had not made her feel like a burden. He had simply made room. He'd given her the cot in the back of the shop, shown her where the good tools were kept versus the ones you only used when the good ones were occupied, and started talking to her about leather, the way other men talk to their daughters about weather or horses, constantly, naturally, as if it were simply the language of the world. By the time she was 12, she could identify grain direction without holding the hide up to the light. By 15, she could set a welt stitch tighter than most men twice her age. By the time she was grown, 24 now, and slight, and possessed of a watchfulness that people sometimes mistook for shyness or dullness, she was better at the craft than Rowan had ever been. And both of them knew it, though neither said so aloud. The shop was hers by default. There was no formal arrangement, no document signed. It was simply understood. Rowan had grown stiff in his hands over the last 2 years, the joints swelling in a way that made detailed work painful, and he'd taken to sitting near the front window, supposedly keeping an eye on things, but mostly just watching the street and occasionally offering commentary on the people passing by. Maren had taken over the bench, the orders, the bookkeeping. The customers had barely noticed the transition, which told her something about how visible she'd been all along. She had not minded exactly, or she had told herself she hadn't. She was not the kind of woman who needed the room to turn when she walked in. She had her work, she had Rowan, and she had the particular satisfaction of a thing made well, the way a good stitch line felt under her thumb, the smell of fresh-cut leather, the quiet pleasure of a last fitted perfectly to a heel. Those things were enough. She had decided they were enough, but grief, she was learning, did not care what you had decided. She buried him on a Wednesday, in the small cemetery on the hill east of town where the grass grew thick and uneven and half the headstones had already started leaning. The minister from the church on 4th Street said the appropriate words. A handful of people came, mostly neighbors and a few longtime customers who'd heard the news and felt obligated. Nobody from the ranching families, none of the men who ran the town's affairs. Rowan Hale had occupied a useful but unimportant position in Coldwater Creek's social order, and his funeral reflected that honestly. Maren stood at the graveside in her second-best dress. She'd worn her best one once to a supper she'd been invited to by mistake, and it had not gone well, and watched the dirt go over the box, and felt the specific heavy weight of a world with one fewer person in it who had known her name since before she could say it herself. Afterward, a woman named Clara Finch, who ran the dry goods store and had an opinion on everything, stopped her on the path down the hill. "You'll be selling the shop, I suppose," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "No," Marin said. Clara looked at her with the particular brand of pity that was really just condescension with softer edges. "It'll be hard going, a woman alone in that trade. You might do better to find work with Mrs. Aldrich. She's looking for a girl." Marin thanked her for the thought and kept walking. That was the whole of her grief, as far as the town of Coldwater Creek was concerned. A burial, a brief exchange on a hillside path, and then nothing. She went back to the shop, put on her work apron, and started on the saddle order she'd left half-finished the morning Rowan took his final bad turn. The leather was exactly as she'd left it. The tools were in their places. Everything was where it was supposed to be. And she sat down at the bench and worked until her hands were too tired to hold the awl, and she did not cry until she was lying in the dark in the back room, alone in a way that was different from any alone she'd felt before. She gave herself that one night, then she got up and went back to work. The Callaway boot arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the funeral. Marin was in the middle of repairing a set of traces for a farmer from up the valley when the shop door opened and a man walked in who she recognized immediately, the way you recognize someone who had been described to you your whole life without ever quite materializing in person. Rhett Callaway was taller than she'd imagined, and rougher looking, not in an unkempt way, but in the way of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and had simply accepted the consequences. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, with the kind of face that had been weathered past easy attractiveness into something more interesting. A jaw that was a degree too sharp, a nose that had been broken and imperfectly reset, and eyes the color of old creek water, greenish-gray, flat, in the way of still surfaces that could be very deep or very shallow, and gave nothing away about which. He carried his hat in one hand and a boot in the other. The boot was wrapped in a piece of cloth that might have been a feed sack at some previous point in its life. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the shop with the careful, assessing expression of a man who did not often enter spaces he didn't already know. "Help you," Marin said without looking up from the traces. She'd learned early on that putting work down to greet customers made them feel obligated to apologize for interrupting, which wasted everyone's time. "Looking for the leather worker," he said. "Found her." A brief pause. "The old man, Hale, he died 3 weeks ago." She set down the awl and looked up. "I own the shop now. If that's going to be a problem, the nearest other leather man is in Hartwell, about 30 miles east." He looked at her steadily for a moment, then he unwrapped the boot and set it on the counter. "Boot needs work," he said. She came to look at it. It was a good boot, or had been, once. The leather was quality stuff, the kind that cost real money, worked to a deep brown black with years of careful conditioning. It was the right boot, she could see that immediately, and the problem that had brought it here was visible before she even picked it up. The heel had separated from the welt on the lateral side, peeling away with the kind of clean, even split that usually meant the stitching had failed all at once rather than gradually. She picked it up. This boot was heavier than she expected. "How'd this happen?" she asked. "Don't know. Noticed the heel was loose yesterday morning." She turned the boot over, running her thumb along the separation. The stitching was indeed gone. Not broken, not worn through, but gone, cleanly, as if it had been cut or dissolved. But the thread ends she could see were too short for cutting, too even. She reached for the small hook tool she used for working inside tight spaces and eased the separation open a little further. There was something inside. Her expression didn't change. She'd learned in years of working with people who brought things to be repaired that reacting visibly to surprises was rarely useful. She kept her face neutral and used the hook to widen the gap another fraction. A piece of paper, folded small, tucked between the layers of the heel stack, held in place by the stitching that had since been removed. She did not pull it out. Instead, she set the boot down and looked at Rhett Callaway, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "This is repair work," she said, "not quick work. I'd want to take it apart, check the construction throughout, before I quote you a price. Could be the heel separation is showing you something worse underneath." He nodded slowly. "How long?" "Give me a few hours. Come back after midday." He looked at her for another moment, That same flat, unreadable look. And then he nodded again, put his hat back on, and left. Marin waited until she heard his boots on the steps outside, then waited another full minute to be certain he'd actually moved on and wasn't lingering by the window. Then she picked up the boot again, reached inside with the hook, and eased the folded paper out. She set it on the workbench and looked at it without touching it for a long moment. Then she unfolded it. The paper was small, about the size of a playing card, and the writing on it was tiny, cramped, done in pencil rather than ink. It looked like it had been written quickly or by someone whose hands were unsteady. Corridor runs southeast from Decker's northern fence. Brands altered at the Tulsa Creek crossing. Raines knows. Dunmore knows. Tell no one in Coldwater. That was all. Marin read it 3 times. Then she refolded it, tucked it into the small leather pouch she kept pinned inside her apron for needles and small tools, and went back to the boot. The construction was interesting now that she was looking at it with different eyes. The heel had been deliberately tampered with, not damaged tampered with. Someone had removed the stitching along the lateral side cleanly, precisely, and then reattached the heel in a way that would hold for a short time under normal wear before giving way. It was delicate work, professional work even, not the sort of thing an amateur could do without leaving obvious signs. Someone had wanted that note to travel inside this boot, and they'd wanted the heel to fail eventually, forcing the boot to be brought to a leather worker, someone who would open the construction and find what was inside. She sat back on her stool and thought about that for a long time. The boot belonged to Rhett Calloway. That much was obvious. It was custom-made for a specific foot, and it had years of wear on it that mapped to a particular gait. Calloway was the owner of the largest cattle operation in the valley, the man who'd built Hawk Ridge Ranch from a single quarter section into something that spanned most of the southern pasture land between Coldwater Creek and the territorial line. If someone had placed this note in his boot, they'd done it in a way that ensured he'd find it only if he brought the boot to be repaired, or find it himself if he ever took the heel apart, which ranchers almost never did. The note wasn't meant for Calloway. Or wasn't only meant for Calloway, it was meant for whoever worked on the boot. She picked up the boot again and examined the inside carefully, running her fingers along the insole, checking the toe box, feeling for anything else. There was a mark near the ball of the foot, a small symbol scratched into the leather with something sharp. Not a defect. Too deliberate for a defect. It looked like a cattle brand she didn't recognize, a circle with a cross through it, elongated at the bottom. She'd never seen that brand registered in Coldwater Creek. By the time Calloway came back, she had the boot taken apart to its component layers on the workbench and had made several observations she wasn't quite sure what to do with. He came through the door at noon, and she could tell by the way he moved that he'd been thinking about leaving the boot here all morning. There was a tension in him that hadn't been there before. Not exactly nervous, but watchful, the way a man got when he was waiting for something to happen and didn't know what direction it would come from. "You find anything?" he said. She considered him for a moment. Then she said, "What do you know about a cattle brand that's a circle with a cross through it, with the bottom leg of the cross extended?" He went very still. "Where'd you see that?" His voice was the same register, but something underneath it had shifted. "Inside your boot." He came to the counter. She pointed to the scratch mark she'd identified, now more visible with the insole pulled back. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. "You know what it is?" she asked. "No," he said. But he said it about a half-second too slow. "Mr. Calloway?" She met his eyes directly, which she didn't always do with customers. It tended to make people uncomfortable, the directness of it, and she'd learned to calibrate it, but she calibrated it now in the other direction. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen without reacting visibly, because there are 2 men across the street who've been watching your horse since you tied it up this morning." He didn't look across the street. Good. Smarter than he looked, or more disciplined. "There was a note inside your heel," she said. She kept her voice level, the same tone she used to discuss pricing. "Someone put it there." The stitching was removed and replaced deliberately. Professional work, not amateur. "The note names a location and 2 men and says to tell no one in Coldwater Creek." She paused. "Which means I'm already doing something the note specifically warned against." A long silence. "You still have it?" he said. "Yes." "Can I see it?" "Not yet." She held his gaze. I want to know something first. Have you had this boot repaired recently by someone other than me? I sent it to a man in Hartwell about 6 weeks ago. Toe box was cracking. What was his name? What? Calloway thought. Didn't catch it. Young fella. Ran the shop near the feed store. She nodded slowly. 6 weeks. Long enough for someone to know the boot had been out of Calloway's possession and would eventually need further work. Long enough for someone to plan the placement of a message. Someone used your boot as a dead drop, she said, a way of passing information without direct contact. Whoever put that note inside wasn't planning for you to find it. They were planning for it to reach whoever next opened the construction. He looked at her. Which was you? Which was me? Outside, a wagon passed. The two men she'd noticed, she didn't know their names, but she'd seen them in town before, always together, always near things that involved Calloway's operation, were still there, not exactly watching, just present in the way that men watching something pretended not to be. I'm going to repair the boot, she said. Standard work, new stitching, the heel reset properly. You'll come back to collect it in 2 days. If you need to speak with me between now and then about something other than the boot, come around the back. The alley door doesn't close properly, and I keep a light on until 10. Rhett Calloway looked at her with that flat creek-water gaze. You're not scared, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm terrified, she said, but I'm also curious. And in my experience, curiosity usually wins. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, more like the absence of whatever neutral expression he'd been maintaining. 2 days, he said. 2 days. He left. The bell above the door chimed once and went quiet. Maren stood at the workbench with the boot in her hands and the note in her apron and thought about what she'd just done. There was a reasonable argument, a very reasonable argument, that she should have handed him the note immediately, wished him good luck, and stayed entirely out of whatever this was. She was a leather worker in a small frontier town. She made things and fixed things. That was the scope of her world, and it had been sufficient. But the note was in her apron. The mark was on the boot, and there was a route described, a corridor running southeast from Decker's northern fence, and a crossing named and 2 men identified, and the specific instruction to tell no one in Coldwater Creek, which meant whoever had written it knew that Coldwater Creek was not safe. She set the boot down and went to the shelf where Rowan had kept the old maps. Song. There were 6 of them, rolled and stored in a wooden box he'd built for the purpose. Regional surveys, mostly, some going back 20 years. She spread the most recent one across the workbench, weighing the corners with tools. Decker's northern fence. She knew the name, Harlan. Decker ran a mid-sized operation north of town. Nothing impressive. The kind of ranch that stayed solvent by not being conspicuous. His fence line ran along the creek bed on the eastern side of the valley before cutting north through rough country that nobody farmed or ranched because the terrain was too broken for cattle, too sparse for crops. But on the map, the rough country between Decker's northern boundary and the territorial line wasn't empty. There was a natural corridor. She could see it now, looking at the contour lines, a long, gradual depression between 2 ridge lines that would channel movement southeast in a way that kept it hidden from the main roads. Following it with her finger, she traced it down to where it would intersect with Tulsa Creek. Tulsa Creek was 6 miles from the nearest settlement. Nobody went out there for anything. The water was alkaline and the grass was poor. But if you were moving cattle you didn't want seen, and you needed somewhere to stop long enough to alter the brands. She took her finger off the map and looked at the wall for a while. Then she got up, locked the front door, turned the sign to closed, and went to find her grandfather's old field notebook, the one he'd used in his years before the shop when he'd ridden survey lines for the Territorial Land Office and learned the country from the inside out. She had 2 days. She intended to use them. The notebook was in the chest under the cot, beneath a folded wool blanket and a leather-bound ledger that dated to the shop's first years. She pulled it out and sat on the edge of the cot, turning the pages carefully. Rowan's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who had been taught to respect paper and not waste it. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was looking for the shape of knowledge, the kind of accumulated, unorganized observation that a man built up over years of moving through a place with his eyes open. Notes about terrain, about water sources, about which routes were used by whom and why. Rowan had been a surveyor before he was a leather worker, and old habits had stayed with him. He'd noted things because he noticed things, and she'd inherited that from him. The compulsion to pay attention and record it. There was a section from the early 1860s that covered the northeastern quadrant of the valley, the rough country. She read it slowly, twice. He'd noted the corridor. Not as a corridor. He'd called it a natural drainage way between the limestone ridges, approximately 4 miles in length, impassable in wet season due to flash flood risk, clear in dry months. He'd noted the Tulsa Creek crossing with a remark about the alkaline water and the surprising amount of cattle sign visible in the area for a place with no registered range. Cattle sign. In an area with no registered range. 20 years ago. She sat with that for a long time. Whatever was happening in that corridor hadn't started recently. It was old. It was established. It had been going on long enough that it had become invisible through familiarity, built into the landscape the way a scar becomes part of a face. That was a different kind of problem than a new theft. New crimes had edges. This one had roots. She worked on the boot through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, her hands doing the familiar work while her mind turned over what she knew and what she suspected, and what she had absolutely no way of proving. The note named 2 men, Rains and Dunmore. She knew one of those names. Ellis Rains was a cattle dealer who operated out of an office on the north end of the main street, a narrow-faced man with a permanent expression of mild grievance who bought and sold animals across 3 counties. He was not well liked, but he was considered legitimate. He paid on time. His paperwork was, as far as anyone had ever examined it, in order. Dunmore she didn't know. The name wasn't local. She thought about those 2 men who'd been watching Calloway's horse. She thought about the note saying to tell no one in Coldwater Creek. She thought about the fact that the note had been placed in a boot sent for repair in Hartwell, not in Coldwater, which suggested whoever planted it had reasoned that Coldwater tradespeople couldn't be trusted. She was a Coldwater tradesperson, but she'd found it, and she hadn't been expected to. Whoever placed the note hadn't known the boot would eventually come to her. It had come to her by the ordinary accident of geography and timing, Calloway's boot needing further work and the nearest shop being hers. She tied off the final stitch on the heel, resetting at 9:15 in the evening, and set the boot on the shelf to settle overnight. Then she sat at the bench in the quiet shop, the lamp turned low, and tried to think carefully about what came next. She could give the note to Calloway and let him handle it. That was the obvious option, the one that kept her at the margin of whatever this was. But Calloway had reacted to the Circle Cross brand with a recognition he'd tried to hide, which meant he had some prior awareness of something he hadn't chosen to act on, or hadn't been able to act on, or hadn't known how to act on without proof. She looked at the map still spread across the workbench. She looked at Rowan's notebook, open to the section about the drainage way. Proof was a thing she understood. It was specific and physical and verifiable. A stitch line told you something. A worn heel told you something. The construction of an object told you its history if you knew how to read it. A route through broken country, a crossing on an alkali creek, 2 names and an instruction to stay silent. That was the beginning of something. Not proof yet, but the shape of where proof might be found. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark in the back room and listened to Coldwater Creek going about its usual business outside the window. The sound of a saloon somewhere, the distant complaint of a dog, the ordinary hum of a place that didn't know it had a problem. Or knew, she corrected herself, knew, and had decided not to look at it. She had been invisible in this town her entire life. She had been the quiet woman at the end of the street, the one you went to when your leather needed work, the one nobody mentioned in conversations about the valley's affairs. She had accepted that because she hadn't known what else to do with it. But invisible, she was thinking now, wasn't only a disadvantage. She closed her eyes. In 2 days, Rhett Calloway would come back for his boot. By then, she intended to know considerably more than she did now. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up, and outside the window the night sounds of Coldwater Creek continued without her, and she slept, and for once she did not dream about her grandfather. She dreamed about maps. She was back at the maps before sunrise, not because she'd slept well, she hadn't, but because lying awake in the dark thinking about something was a different kind of useless than lying awake in the dark doing nothing, and at 4 in the morning, with the town still quiet and the lamp burning low on the workbench, She'd decided she'd rather be useless in a productive direction. She'd pulled 3 of the 6 surveys from Rowan's box and laid them side by side across the bench, overlapping their edges where the coverage met. And now she was doing what she'd learned to do with leather patterns, looking at the whole shape before she started cutting anything. The valley, as the map showed it, was a long, uneven bowl tilted slightly south, with Coldwater Creek running along its western edge and the territorial line cutting across the northeast corner at an angle that didn't respect the terrain. The registered ranches were clustered in the southern and central portions, where the grass was good and the water was reliable. Toward the north and east, the land got complicated. Limestone ridges, broken arroyos, the kind of geography that made survey lines approximate and actual use depended on who was stubborn enough to push through it. Decker's operation sat right at the edge of that complicated country. His registered range stopped at the northern fence, as the note had specified, and beyond it the maps showed mostly blank space with contour lines that indicated rough terrain and a surveyor's note in faded pencil that read, "Unimproved, no registered claim, seasonal flooding risk." No registered claim, which meant no one was legally watching it. She traced the natural corridor again with her finger, following the depression between the ridgelines southeast toward the Tulsa Creek crossing. On this older survey, the crossing was marked with a small symbol she hadn't noticed the night before, not a standard surveying mark, but something added later by hand, in different ink. A square with a dot in the center. She didn't know what it meant, but it had been added deliberately by someone who'd been out there and found it worth noting, and that mattered. She thought about Rowan's notebook entry. Surprising amount of cattle sign for a place with no registered range. He'd written that 20 years ago and filed it away and never done anything with it because it wasn't his business, and the frontier was full of things that were somebody else's business. That was how something like this survived, not through active concealment alone, but through the accumulated weight of people deciding it wasn't their concern. She got up and made coffee. It was a task that required her full attention because the stove had a quirk, a loose fitting on the flue that let cold air in at exactly the wrong angle. And if you didn't account for it, you ended up with smoke in the room instead of heat in the pot. Rowan had been meaning to fix it for 3 years. She'd been meaning to fix it herself for the past 3 weeks. Neither of them had gotten around to it, which was either a commentary on the nature of grief or simply evidence that flue fittings were easy to ignore until they weren't. She fixed it now, at 4:30 in the morning, with a piece of scrap leather and a copper tack, because she needed something she could actually solve. Then she made the coffee and stood at the bench with the cup warming her hands and looked at the maps again. The corridor was approximately 4 miles long, as Rowan had noted. The Tulsa Creek crossing was near its southeastern end. From there, following the creek bed south for another 3 or 4 miles would bring you to the edge of organized rangeland, where registered cattle would blend easily with stolen animals that had been given new markings. From there, to a dealer who knew how to move them without documentation. To Ellis Raines, if the note was right. She set the coffee down and found the page in her small ledger where she'd started making notes the night before. She was not a woman who trusted her memory completely. She trusted her hands and her eyes, but memories had a way of rearranging themselves without permission, filling in gaps with what you expected rather than what you'd actually observed. Writing things down kept the record honest. She added the crossing mark to her notes, the square with the dot. She added the surveyor's note about no registered claim. She added the timestamp. Rowan's observation was from the early 1860s, which meant this operation, in some form, had been running for at least 2 decades. That changed the scale of what she was looking at. A new theft ring could be dismantled with a single set of arrests. Something this old had infrastructure. It had people who knew about it and had decided not to notice. People who benefited from the stability of its continued existence. People who would push back against any disruption because disruption cost them something even if they weren't directly involved. She thought about the note's instruction. Tell no one in Coldwater. Not tell no one. Tell no one in Coldwater. The distinction was specific and deliberate. Whoever wrote it had a geography of trust in mind. Coldwater Creek was not safe, but somewhere beyond it might be. She was still thinking about that when, at shortly before 7 in the morning, someone knocked at the alley door. Mutt. She went still. Then she crossed the back room quietly and stood to the side of the door rather than in front of it, a habit she'd developed from years of Rowan's stories about what happened to people who opened doors carelessly in rough country. "Who is it?" she said. Not a question, a statement, flat enough to convey that she wanted an answer and wasn't going to open anything until she had one. "Calloway?" She opened the door. He was standing in the alley with his hat low and his collar up, which was either sensible caution or theater, and she couldn't quite tell which. He looked like he hadn't slept either, but where her sleeplessness had turned inward and quiet, his had apparently produced something closer to agitation. There was a tightness around his jaw that hadn't been there the day before. "I said 2 days," Marin told him. "I know what you said." He glanced down the alley in both directions, then looked back at her. "Something's happened. Can I come in?" She stepped back. He came through the door and she closed it behind him, and he stood in the back room looking at the map spread across the bench with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not quite surprise. More like a man finding something confirmed that he'd suspected was there. "You've been at this all night," he said. Most of it." She went back to the bench and stood facing him across it. "What happened?" He took off his hat and turned it in his hands. It was something to do with his hands. She recognized the impulse. She did the same thing with tools when she was thinking through something difficult. "One of my hands," he said. "Young fella, been with me 3 seasons. Came to me last evening, said he'd seen something out in the North Range he thought I should know about. 2 riders moving a small group of cattle through the breaks north of Decker's fence line. 5 animals. Moving at night. Did he follow them? He's not an idiot. No, he didn't follow them." A pause. "He's also not someone I'd normally take this kind of thing from. He's 20 years old and he sees trouble everywhere. But with what I found in my boot..." He stopped. "You do still have it." "Yes." She reached into the leather pouch at her apron and set the note on the bench between them. He picked it up and read it slowly. She watched his face. The recognition she'd glimpsed the day before was clearer now. Whatever the Circle Cross brand meant to him, the note connected to it in a way that reached something specific. "What is it?" she asked. "The brand." He looked up from the note. "You don't miss much." "That's what I do for a living." "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, 8 months ago I had a count come up short. 43 head, just gone. Not strayed, not sick, not evidence of anything I could put my finger on. I reported it to the sheriff. Holloway looked into it for about a week and told me the animals had likely drifted south through a gap in my fence line, which wasn't possible because I'd walked that fence myself and there was no gap. His jaw tightened. 2 weeks after that, I got a letter, unsigned. Said if I kept pushing the count issue, I'd lose more than cattle. "You kept the letter?" "No." He said it with the tone of a man who'd made a decision he'd since reconsidered. "Burned it. Figured it was a bluff." "And the brand?" "The letter had a mark at the bottom, same mark you found inside the boot." He set the note down. "I didn't tell anyone. Not Holloway, not my foreman, no one. Because the letter was right that I didn't know who I could trust, and wrong that it was going to stop me from trying to figure it out." Marin looked at the note again. "Raines knows. Dunmore knows." "Dunmore," she said. "Do you know that name?" "Victor Dunmore. He's a land speculator out of the territorial capital. Comes through the valley 2-3 times a year, buys distressed property when ranches fail." His voice was careful and flat. 4 ranches have failed in this valley in the past 6 years. All of them in areas adjacent to the route you've been tracing on those maps. She looked at the maps, then at him. "He's not just stealing cattle," she said. "No." Rhett Calloway set his hat on the corner of the bench. "He's collapsing operations. Stealing enough to hurt, but not enough to obviously prove theft. Running ranchers to the edge and then buying them out for a fraction of the value." He paused. "And if the sheriff is in it?" "The note doesn't say the sheriff is in it. The note says to tell no one in Coldwater." He looked at her steadily. "Holloway is Coldwater." She thought about Sheriff Holloway. She'd had minimal interaction with him over the years. A quiet, unremarkable man who ran a quiet, unremarkable office and was known mainly for resolving disputes before they became problems and avoiding confrontations that required significant effort. She had not disliked him. She had also never had particular reason to trust him. "All right," she said. "If Holloway is involved, then any complaint filed locally disappears. That's why the note specifies Coldwater." "So what do you do with a note that says, 'Don't talk to your sheriff'?" You build something he can't make disappear, she said. She looked at the maps. Documentation, physical evidence, a chain of proof that doesn't run through a local office. She picked up the note carefully. Who delivered your boot to Hartwell? Who handles that kind of errand for you? My foreman, usually. Hector Vance. Do you trust him? A pause, shorter than she expected. Yes, he's been with me 12 years. Then the person who placed that note in your boot knew your boot was leaving Coldwater for repair, knew your routine well enough to intercept it in Hartwell, and had either access to the repair shop there or a contact inside it. She set the note back down. That's not a random act. That's someone who's been watching your operation closely enough to know its logistics, and who has chosen to communicate through the most indirect channel available to them because every direct channel is compromised. Calloway was quiet for a moment. You think about things sideways, he said. I think about construction. How something is built tells you about the person who built it and what they were trying to achieve. She looked at him. Whoever put that note in your boot was scared. The writing is small and the pencil is light. Someone trying to leave as little impression as possible. And they chose a message that points somewhere specific without being specific enough to be used against them if it was found by the wrong person first. Found by you instead, he said. Found by me instead. He looked at the maps again, and she could see him working through something, turning it over. He was not a stupid man, she was starting to understand. He had the practical intelligence of someone who'd built something real from difficult materials, which was a different kind of smart than book learning, but not lesser for it. I can't go to the territorial marshal without more than a note and a boot, he said. That's a long ride and a hard argument, and if I'm wrong about Holloway, making that argument gets back to him, and then I've shown my hand to people I can't see. You're not wrong about Holloway, she said, but I agree you need more than this. So what do you need? She hadn't expected the question framed that way. She'd expected, what do we need or what needs to happen? Some version that didn't put her at the center of it. The directness caught her slightly off guard, and she was aware of that in the way she was aware of the moment before she started cutting leather, the point at which the pattern was set, and there was no more adjusting, only committing. I need 2 days, she said. The same 2 days I already have before your boot is ready. I need you to stay visible and normal. Go about your business. Nothing that looks like investigation. And I need the name of any rancher in this valley who you would stake your life on. He thought about that. Tom Aldridge runs a small outfit southeast of mine. And maybe Nora Vass, she's been ranching her late husband's place for 4 years, knows this country well. Will they talk to me? Why wouldn't they? Because I'm a leather worker at the end of the main street, and the only reason anyone in this valley knows my name is that their tack needs mending. She said it without bitterness, just as a statement of fact. They have no reason to take what I bring them seriously. He met her eyes. I'll talk to them first. Don't tell them everything. Tell them I may have information about the missing cattle. Let them decide how much they want to hear. She folded the maps carefully, not back to their original roles, but in the flat, organized way she used for patterns she intended to reference again. And tell them to come to the shop separately, not together, not conspicuously. You're being careful, he said. The people who built this thing have been running it for 20 years, she said. They didn't last 20 years by being careless. I don't intend to be careless either. He picked up his hat. At the door he paused and turned back. Why are you doing this? He asked. You could have given me the note yesterday and been done with it. She considered several answers. The honest one was complicated, and she wasn't entirely sure she understood it herself. Something about Rowan's notebook entry 20 years old, gathering dust. Something about the 4 ranches that had failed. Something about what it meant that this town had been watching something wrong happen for 2 decades and had collectively decided it wasn't anyone's business. My grandfather noticed something wasn't right out there, she said. He wrote it down and filed it away. Nobody asked him about it, so he never said anything. She looked at the door. I've been filing things away my whole life because nobody asked. I'm tired of it. He nodded once, slowly, as if that answer made more sense to him than he'd expected. Then he went out the alley door, and she locked it behind him and went back to the bench. Tom Aldridge came in the following morning, before the shop was officially open, while she was heating the tools she'd need for the day's work. He was a compact man in his 50s with the kind of face that had done a lot of weather and come out the other side stripped of everything except what was essential. He sat in the chair she kept for customers and did not fidget, which she appreciated. Calloway says you found something in his boot, he said.
Yes. She told him what she'd found, cleanly and without embellishment, the same way she'd describe a construction defect to a customer. This is what I observed, this is what it indicates, this is what I think it means. She showed him the maps and the note and Rowan's notebook entry. She showed him the scratch mark on the boot's insole and explained what it told her about how deliberately the heel had been tampered with. He listened without interrupting, which was the kind of quality she was learning to appreciate in people who were worth talking to. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the maps. I lost 30 head 2 seasons ago, he said. Reported it to Holloway. He said probably a fence breach, same as he told Calloway. A pause. I've got a tight fence. Did you get a letter? He looked at her sharply. How'd you know about a letter? Calloway got one too. Unsigned. Circle cross mark. Aldridge's jaw tightened. Same mark. Mine said to stop asking questions or I'd lose the whole herd. He looked down at his hands. I've got a wife and 3 kids. I stopped asking questions. She didn't judge him for it. It was not a difficult calculation. I'm not asking you to do anything dangerous, she said. I'm asking you to tell me what you know about that corridor country north of Decker's fence. Whether you've ever seen anything there, heard anything, things you filed away. He talked for an hour. By the end of it, she had 4 pages of notes in the small, dense script she used when she needed to get a lot of information into a small space. 3 different sightings of riders in the north breaks over the past 2 years, always at night, always moving south. A ranch hand from the failed Kellerman operation who'd told Aldridge before he left the valley that he'd seen cattle moving through the limestone country, cattle that didn't match any brand he recognized. The name of a territorial land office clerk in the capital who Aldridge thought might be sympathetic. A man named Asa Pruitt, who'd been quietly unhappy about the pattern of land transfers in this valley for years, but hadn't had anything concrete to bring forward. Asa Pruitt. She wrote it down twice. Nora Vass came that afternoon. Later, after the shop's usual customers had come and gone. She was younger than Maren had expected, early 30s with the kind of competence that came off her like a temperature, steady and matter-of-fact. She'd run her husband's ranch alone since his death, handling the hands and the cattle and the accounts with a thoroughness that the valley's men had initially doubted and subsequently stopped doubting because the numbers didn't lie. She sat in the same customer's chair and looked at the maps and said, without preamble, I know where the corridor comes out. Maren looked up from her notes. The southeastern end, where it meets registered range. Nora leaned forward and put her finger on the map at a spot south of the Tulsa Creek crossing. There's a dry wash that runs between my eastern boundary and the old Kellerman property, which Dunmore bought 18 months ago. Cattle have been coming through that wash. I've found sign twice. Fresh sign, not drift. Why didn't you report it? Nora gave her a look that was almost amused and mostly tired. Because Kellerman's was Dunmore's by then, and anything that came from that direction, legally, was his cattle on his land. And because Holloway had already told me twice that any grazing irregularities in my area were probably from drift off the unclaimed country, and the third time I brought something to him, he started looking at me like I was causing problems instead of reporting them. She sat back. I'm a widow running a ranch on a frontier. I can't afford to be the kind of woman who causes problems. Maren understood that with the specific, complete understanding of a woman who had made the same calculation in a different context her entire adult life. You won't be causing problems, she said. You'll be providing documentation. There's a difference? There is, if the documentation is good enough that the problem can't be laid back at your feet. She held Nora's gaze. I know how to build something that holds together. It's what I do. Nora studied her for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? Dates and details on the sign you found in the wash. Description. Hoof count, direction of travel, any distinguishing marks. Anything else you've noticed that seemed wrong and you've been not mentioning to anyone. What came out over the next 90 minutes was methodical and precise and useful. Nora had, in fact, been keeping her own records, not in a formal log, but in a household account book she'd used to note anything that affected the ranch's operation. Cattle sign in the wash, twice, dates noted. Account discrepancy in the Kellerman adjacent pasture she'd been leasing before the sale. 6 head she'd never recovered. The name of a drover who'd worked the Dunmore acquisition briefly
and left suddenly after 3 weeks. A man named Carver, who'd ended up working a small operation in the next county west, and who Nora suspected had seen something that had made him want to put distance between himself and the valley. Marin noted all of it. By the time Nora left, the light outside was going golden, and the shop felt different than it had that morning. Fuller, somehow, the way a piece of work felt once the pattern was fully cut, and you could see for the first time what the whole thing was going to be. She spread her notes across the bench and looked at what she had. A note from an unknown person, hidden in a boot, naming a route and 2 men. A map that showed the route. A 20-year-old field observation that confirmed the route's existence and use. 2 ranchers with corroborating accounts of theft and intimidation. Physical sign at the corridor's entry and exit points. A pattern of land acquisition that followed the theft pattern geographically and temporally. The name of a potentially sympathetic official at the Territorial Land Office. The name of a witness who'd walked away. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Not for something that had run this long with this much local protection. But it was the beginning of enough. And the beginning was what she'd needed to confirm before the next step. She put the notes in order, folded the maps back to their flat configuration, and went to work on the day's remaining orders. A bridle, 2 sets of traces, a pair of work boots belonging to a farmer from the north end of the valley, who always paid late and always apologized for it with such genuine feeling that she'd never been able to hold it against him. She worked until the light went, then sat at the bench in the early dark. Tomorrow she needed to talk to Calloway again. What she was going to propose was not going to be comfortable, and she was not sure he'd agree. And she was not entirely sure she wasn't going to change her mind between now and the morning. But the shape of it was clear in her mind, clear the way the grain of a good piece of leather was clear when you held it at the right angle to the light. Not obvious, not announced, but there, unmistakable, once you knew what you were looking for. She couldn't send someone else into that corridor to gather proof. Aldridge had a wife and 3 children and had already made his calculation. Nora Vass was managing a ranch alone and had 3 hired hands who depended on her staying operational and alive. Calloway was too visible. The moment he started moving around the North Breaks, anyone watching the valley's ranching operations would notice. But a leather worker from the end of the main street, a woman nobody looked at twice, a woman who could be out in the field country on the pretext of sourcing quality rawhide or following up on a stray tool complaint from a ranch hand, she was not the person anyone would watch. She was not the person anyone thought to account for. That was the only kind of advantage she had. But it was hers. She put the tools away carefully, each in its place, the way Rowan had taught her. You put things where they belong when you're done with them, he'd said once, so that when you need them next, you're not spending time finding them. You're ready. She locked the front door and went to the back room and lay down on the cot, still dressed, with the leather pouch containing the note tucked into her apron pocket. Outside, Coldwater Creek made its usual evening sounds, and somewhere further away the limestone country in the North Breaks sat in the dark, quiet and unremarked, doing exactly what it had been doing for 20 years. Waiting, she supposed, for someone to finally look at it properly. She had every intention of being that person. She told Calloway her plan the next morning, standing in the alley behind the shop with the sun still low and the air carrying that particular October sharpness that made everything feel more serious than it might otherwise. He didn't like it. She'd expected that. "You want to go into the corridor yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. His tone was the specific flatness of a man choosing words carefully because the ones that came naturally would have been too loud for an alley conversation. "I want to go into the corridor and document what's there," she said. "Yes. That's not documentation work. If someone finds you out there, that's a different conversation entirely." "I know what it is." She kept her voice even. "But think about who goes unnoticed in that kind of country. You ride out to the North Breaks and everyone with an interest in this operation is watching before you clear the town limits. Tom Aldridge goes, same problem. Nora Vass is already on their radar. She's been pushing back on the drift explanation for 2 years and they know it." She looked at him directly. "Nobody is watching me. Nobody has ever watched me. I could walk through the middle of Coldwater Creek carrying a sign that said, 'I know what you're doing,' and half this town would look through me anyway." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite the opposite. "That's a hard thing to say about yourself," he said. "It's a true thing, and right now, true is more useful than comfortable." She pulled her coat tighter. The morning air had real teeth to it. I'm not proposing something reckless. I've spent 2 days reading maps and talking to people who know that country. I know the entry point. I know the approximate route. I know where the crossing is. I go in on foot from the eastern approach, which is the long way but keeps me off the main corridor until I'm already inside it. I carry a satchel and a legitimate reason for being in field country if anyone asks. There's a tannery supplier who does site visits on ranches for rawhide quality assessment. I'm a leather worker. It's a plausible errand. And if someone asks you to prove it, then I show them the order forms I'm going to write up this morning with the supplier's name on them, and I talk to them about hide quality for as long as they'll listen, which won't be very long because it's a genuinely tedious subject. She paused. I need you to do something for me while I'm out there. What? Stay visible. Be in town. Have a drink at the saloon, talk to people, be the kind of man who is clearly not doing anything suspicious, because if something goes wrong and they start looking for a threat, I need all attention pointed at you and not at the direction I'm coming from. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the part of it he was going to resist most. I don't like the part where if something goes wrong, I'm sitting in a saloon, he said. I know. What happens if something goes wrong? Then it goes wrong and I deal with it. She said it plainly, without bravado, because bravado would have undermined the whole thing. I'm not going to pretend there's no risk. There is. But the risk of doing nothing is that this continues for another 20 years, and 2 or 3 more families lose their ranches, and the valley keeps declining in ways that everyone shrugs at and attributes to hard luck. She looked at him. I don't accept that. He turned his hat in his hands. She was starting to recognize that as his version of what she did with tools when she was working something out. How long? He said finally. I go in tomorrow evening, after dark. The movement in that corridor, based on what Nora and Tom described, happens at night. They move animals through undercover of darkness, which means there will be activity. I need to observe it, document it, and be out before first light. She hesitated, then added the part she'd been calculating since the night before. I want you and Tom Aldridge to meet me at the eastern edge of Decker's fence line at midnight. Not inside the corridor, outside it, at the boundary. If I'm not out by an hour before sunrise, you come in. He looked at her steadily. An hour before sunrise is not much time. No. But a lot can happen before then, and I'd rather have you positioned and ready than have you riding in at first light when anyone watching will see you coming from half a mile off. She reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. I've drawn the approach route. The eastern entry is through a rock cut. Tom described it, said there's a distinctive double formation, 2 limestone columns side by side. Hard to miss even in the dark. He took the paper, looked at it, looked at her. You should have been a general, he said. It came out sounding like something more than a compliment and less than one simultaneously. I'm a leather worker, she said. Let's keep it simple. Bub. She spent the rest of that day preparing in the methodical way that was the only way she knew how to prepare for anything, by accounting for every variable she could account for and making peace with the ones she couldn't. She assembled a proper satchel, one of her own making, the kind she used for field visits, worn enough to look used and structured enough to carry what she needed without advertising that it was carrying anything specific. Inside it, she put a small notebook and 3 pencils, a piece of charcoal wrapped in cloth for making rubbings of brand marks, a measuring cord she used for custom fittings, and a tinderbox, not because she expected to need fire, but because the October nights were going cold, and she'd rather have it unused than need it, and not have it. She added a canteen, a strip of dried beef, and the small folded collection of maps she'd made by transcribing the relevant sections of Rowan's surveys onto fresh paper, noting the corridor route and the Tulsa Creek crossing and the position of the limestone entry columns as Tom had described them. She did not bring a weapon. She'd thought about it carefully. There was a small pistol Rowan had kept in the shop, an old piece, reliable enough that she knew how to use in the basic functional sense. But she was going in alone, into a place where armed men would be operating, and if she was found and searched and was carrying a weapon, the conversation that followed would be significantly more dangerous than if she was found carrying a satchel of leatherworkers' tools and a story about hide assessment. A weapon changed what she was. She needed to remain, in appearance, the unremarkable woman she'd always been. She was not entirely comfortable with that decision. She made it anyway. She also took, from the inner pocket of the leather pouch she kept pinned in her apron, the original note from Calloway's boot. She'd made a careful copy, twice, one copy for herself and one for Calloway. But she wanted the original in her possession, not because it was irreplaceable, but because having it gave her a kind of anchor, a reminder of what had started this, and what she was going to finish. That evening, while the last light was still working its way down the western sky, she sat at the workbench and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Asa Pruitt at the Territorial Land Office. The name Tom Aldridge had given her. A careful, factual summary of what she'd assembled, asking him to expect further documentation in the next several days and to hold it against possible suppression by local authorities. The second was to the Territorial Marshal's Office, briefer, requesting that a deputy be prepared to receive evidentiary material regarding cattle theft and land fraud in the Coldwater Creek Valley. The third was to no one in particular, a sealed envelope addressed simply to be opened if required, containing copies of all her notes, the maps, and a summary of every conversation she'd had in the past 4 days. She gave the first 2 to Tom Aldridge's wife that evening, walking to their place on the pretext of delivering the repaired traces she'd finished that afternoon. Mrs. Aldridge was a quiet woman who asked no questions about why the leatherworker was handing her letters that needed posting by the first morning stage. She simply took them, said she'd see to it, and thanked Marin for the traces. The third envelope she left at the back of Rowan's chest, under the wool blanket, with a brief note on top directing Calloway to it if 3 days passed and she hadn't returned. Then she went to bed, lay flat on her back staring at the ceiling, and waited for midnight. She was at the eastern approach to Decker's fence line before 10. She'd gone in at dusk, while the light was still just enough to navigate by, taking the long route Tom had described, south around the valley's populated edge, then northeast through scrub country that was nobody's registered range and rarely traveled. Her boots were her own work, a pair she'd made 3 years ago for rough country, heavier than her shop boots, with a double sole and a low heel that wouldn't catch on rock or root. The limestone columns Tom had described were there exactly as he'd said. 2 formations side by side, each roughly the height of a standing man, so similar in dimension and coloring that they looked almost placed rather than natural. She put her hand on the nearer one. The stone was cold, already releasing the day's heat into the October night. She went through. The corridor opened in front of her gradually, the way a long room reveals itself when you walk into it from the side. Not a dramatic expansion, but a slow widening, the ridge lines on either side pulling back from each other as the natural drainage way opened up. The ground underfoot was firm, the limestone shelf close to the surface in most places, which meant her footsteps were quiet, and also meant that there would be minimal track evidence from her passage. That was a consideration she'd noted from Rowan's map description. The limestone country didn't hold prints the way soft soil did, which was part of why the corridor had stayed invisible for so long. She moved slowly. She was in no hurry. She needed to cover approximately 1.5 miles of corridor before she'd reach the area Tom and Nora had described as the likely activity zone, the section near the Tulsa Creek crossing where the corridor was widest and where the creek provided water for resting animals. The night was clear, which helped with navigation and made her more visible than she'd have liked. She kept to the shadowed base of the western ridgeline where she could, moving in the way she'd learned from years of working in a shop where noise carried. Deliberately, weight transferred gradually from heel to toe, pausing whenever she thought she heard something ahead or above. She heard things. The ordinary sounds of open country at night, wind through dry grass, something small moving fast in the rocks above her. The distant low of cattle that might have been 1 mile away or more. She couldn't tell yet whether the cattle she was hearing were part of what she was looking for or simply the ordinary sound of the legitimate ranches to the south. She kept moving. At approximately the 1 mile point, she stopped. There were men ahead. She hadn't heard voices, not yet, but she'd seen the brief flicker of a shielded lantern, the kind that threw a narrow beam that could be directed and controlled. Someone was using a light carefully, not wanting it to be seen from the ridgeline. That told her she was in the right place, because people working legitimate country at night didn't typically bother hiding their lanterns. She eased off the base of the ridgeline and found a low outcropping of rock that gave her a position slightly elevated from the corridor floor, sheltered on three sides, with a clean sightline down the widening ahead. She settled into it the way she settled into a work posture. Low, stable, her weight distributed in a way she could hold for a long time without moving. The lantern moved again. She could make out figures now, dark shapes against the slightly lighter ground of the corridor floor. 3 men, she counted. Possibly 4. There was a fourth shape that might have been a man or might have been a large pack on a standing horse. The horse was definitely there. She could hear the soft shuffle of hooves on stone. And cattle. She could hear them more clearly now, a small group, the low sounds they made when they were tired and uncertain of their surroundings. Animals moved somewhere. Not many, 8, maybe 10 head. She opened the satchel quietly and took out the notebook and a pencil. She pressed the notebook flat against the rock and began writing in the tiny, compressed script she used when space was limited, keeping her hand close to the surface so the pencil's movement wouldn't catch any light. Time. Location within corridor. Number of figures. Number of animals. Direction of movement. She wrote everything she could observe and noted clearly what she was inferring versus what she was directly seeing. That distinction mattered. Rowan had told her once, in a context that had nothing to do with crime, it had been about a customer disputing a repair, that the difference between what you knew and what you assumed was the difference between an argument that held and one that fell apart. She'd never forgotten it. The lantern moved again, and for a moment the beam swept across the nearest group of cattle, and she could see the animals clearly. She could see their brands. She took out the charcoal and the measuring cord and looked at what she was looking at. The brands were wrong. Not obviously wrong, not the kind of wrong a casual eye would catch. But she had spent 20 years examining marks pressed into surfaces: leather, metal, wood, hide. She knew how a brand settled into the skin of an animal, the way the scar tissue formed and how the original mark shaped that formation. What she was seeing on these animals was not the original mark. The original mark had been worked over, not crudely, not with a running iron dragged across existing scar tissue the way a desperate man did it, but precisely with something that had added to the existing brand in a way that transformed its registration to a different design entirely. It was careful work. Someone had practiced it. Someone had access to the right tools and the knowledge of how to use them. She sketched what she saw as accurately as she could in the darkness, pressing the charcoal lightly against the notebook paper, catching the silhouette of the visible animals, and the altered brand marks on the two she could see most clearly. Below, the men were talking. The distance and the slight wind made the words difficult to resolve into anything specific, but she caught tone and rhythm. One voice that gave directions, 2 that responded. The first voice had an authority to it, not loud, not aggressive, just the flat expectation of someone accustomed to being listened to. She watched and wrote for 40 minutes. What she accumulated in that 40 minutes was, she thought, the most important 40 minutes of work she'd ever done in her life, which was saying something given that she'd spent most of her life doing work that no one noticed. Count of animals, 9 head. Brands? Altered from what she believed to be Aldridge's mark. She couldn't be certain without a registered comparison, but the base formation was consistent with what Tom had described as his own branding, an angular double bar with a hook on the left. The altered version added a circle around the outer edge and removed the hook, transforming it into a completely different registration. The addition was healed over, which meant these animals had been held somewhere for the alteration to set before being moved through the corridor. That required a holding location. She added that to the notes. A holding location existed somewhere north of the corridor's entry. Worth finding. The drover on the horse, she'd resolved the fourth shape into a man on horseback, moving slowly at the rear of the small herd, stopped and said something to the man with the lantern. The lantern man responded. The drover turned his horse slightly, and for a moment was facing in her direction, though she was certain he couldn't see her in the rock shadow. He was young. That surprised her. Mid-20s at most, with the uncertain posture of someone who wasn't entirely comfortable with where he was. He wasn't one of the men giving or receiving instructions. He was just the person on the horse, the low-level position, the person who'd been given the job because someone more important had something else to do. She noted that too. Not because it changed what was happening, but because it changed what might be possible. Young men who were uncertain about where they were could sometimes be uncertain about where they were going. The group began moving, not toward her, south, continuing down the corridor toward the Tulsa Creek crossing and the exit that Nora Vass had identified at the dry wash. She let them go and stayed in the rock outcropping until the lantern light had diminished to nothing and the corridor ahead was quiet again. Then she waited another 10 minutes. Then she moved. She needed the crossing. The note had specified it as the location of the brand alterations. Brands altered at the Tulsa Creek crossing. But what she'd observed suggested the alterations happened before the animals entered the corridor, not at the crossing itself. The crossing might be something else. A meeting point, a transfer location, a place where records were made or transactions took place. The creek, when she reached it, was a narrow ribbon of water running over pale rock, the alkaline smell of it sharp in the cold air. The crossing was a wide, shallow section where the rock shelf extended across most of the creek bed, creating a natural ford that would barely wet a horse's fetlock. On the near bank there was evidence of regular use. Packed earth, fire scars from multiple sources over a long period, the kind of accumulation that happened in a place visited repeatedly over years. There were marks in the softer soil near the water's edge, where the rock shelf ended, boot prints and hoof prints together, multiple superimposed sets indicating many separate visits. And there was something else. Tucked into a crevice in the near bank, covered with a flat stone placed with obvious intention, was a small tin box. She crouched and lifted the stone carefully. The box was sealed with a simple latch, not locked. She opened it. Inside were three things: a folded paper that turned out to be a ledger page, covered in columns of numbers and abbreviated entries, a brass token stamped with a stylized D that she didn't recognize, and a second, smaller folded paper that when she opened it contained a list of names. 8 names, she recognized 4 of them. Ellis Raines, the cattle dealer. Harlan Decker, whose fence line had been used as the entry reference in the original note. A man named Fowler, who she knew by reputation as one of the county commissioners. And at the bottom of the list, with a small mark beside it that might have been a star or might have been a smear, Holloway. She held the paper and looked at it for a long moment. Not might be, not possibly. A written record, in someone's handwriting, in a box at a known meeting location, with a ledger page of what looked very much like transaction records. She copied everything into the notebook, every number, every abbreviated entry, every name on the list. Then she refolded the original papers, replaced them in the box, replaced the box in the crevice, replaced the stone. Leave everything as found. Take nothing that could be noticed missing, because the value of this location was that the men using it didn't know it had been compromised. She was about to rise when she heard hooves coming fast. From the south, not the north. From the direction the herd had gone, not from the corridor behind her. Someone riding hard toward the crossing, not trying to be quiet. She was back in the rock shadow before the rider fully materialized out of the darkness. One man, alone, pushing his horse harder than the terrain warranted. He pulled up at the crossing, and the horse blew hard through its nose, dancing sideways, and the man dismounted with the clumsy urgency of someone who'd been riding with news rather than intention. He went straight to the crevice, lifted the stone, opened the box, pulled out the ledger page and the list of names and shoved both into his coat without reading them, not taking records, removing them. Someone had sent word to clear the box. She pressed herself flat against the rock and did not breathe more than she had to. The man was 12 yards away. If he turned around and swept the bank systematically, he'd find her. But he wasn't looking for anything except what he'd come for, and he had it now, and he was moving back to his horse with the compressed speed of a man on an errand with a deadline. He remounted and went back the way he'd come, south, at the same hard pace. She waited until she couldn't hear the hooves any longer. Then she waited another 5 minutes. Then she stood up from the rock shadow and thought very clearly and precisely about what had just happened. Someone knew the box was being used as evidence. Someone had sent a man to clear it. That meant one of several things. They'd seen something that alarmed them tonight and were cleaning up, or they had a warning from someone inside whatever investigation might be building, or this was a regular rotation of records that she'd happened to witness. The regular rotation option was possible, but required a coincidence of timing she wasn't willing to rely on. The warning option was possible, but required someone to know about her investigation, which she had kept extremely tight. The alarmed cleanup option was the most likely. Something had happened, or been reported, that had triggered a precautionary response. Whatever the reason, it changed her timeline. If they were cleaning up, they'd be moving faster now, which meant any window for gathering further evidence in this location was narrowing, and it meant something else, something that sat in her chest with a cold, specific weight. They were still operational. They had communication and they had response capacity, and they were not rattled enough to stop, just rattled enough to be careful. She needed to get her notebooks to people who could act on them before that window closed entirely. She was making her way back along the western ridgeline toward the northern entry when she heard something else, voices. Two of them, ahead and above her, on the ridgeline itself. Not down in the corridor, on top. Someone had taken a position up there, and they were talking quietly, and one of the voices had a quality she recognized from her earlier observation, the flat, directing tone of the man with the lantern. She stopped. The voices were too far up and too muffled by the rock above her to make out words. But they were there, and if there were men on the ridgeline, then leaving through the northern entry was going to bring her into potential sightline of them. The alternative was to go south, through the crossing and out the dry wash exit. But that was the direction the herd had gone, and possibly the direction the rider had come from, and she had no intelligence on what was waiting at that end. She made a decision she didn't particularly like. She moved to the base of the ridgeline and found a diagonal path upward, not toward the voices, but to the north of them, using the darkness and the broken terrain as cover. It was harder going than the corridor floor, and twice she had to stop and redistribute her weight on uncertain rock, and once her foot slipped and she caught herself on a handhold that scraped her palm open against the limestone. She was not graceful about it. She was just quiet. At the top of the ridgeline, she could see more. The full length of the corridor below her, the gleam of the creek to the south, and 200 yards to her right, two figures standing close together at the edge of the ridge, looking down into the corridor. Looking for something, or watching something she couldn't see from her angle. She lay flat on the ridge and did not move. And then one of the figures turned, and even at 200 yards in the poor light, she could see the shape of him well enough to know she'd been right about the sheriff. Holloway. She pressed herself against the rock and held that knowledge in her chest, where it had settled hard and factual, and understood that what she was looking at was not corruption she'd suspected, but corruption she'd confirmed, and the distance between those two things was the distance between a theory and a case. She needed to move. She needed to get off this ridgeline and back to the eastern approach and through the limestone columns before those two men decided to come north. She crawled backward from her position, slowly, inch by careful inch, until she was below the ridgeline's sight horizon. Then she got to her feet and moved quickly along the back slope, heading north, the satchel pressed flat against her body to stop it swinging, the maps and notebooks and the charcoal sketches inside it. Everything she'd gathered, everything she hadn't expected to gather, the ledger numbers and the names and the altered brand sketches, and Holloway's silhouette standing on a ridge above a stolen cattle corridor. She reached the limestone columns. She went through. The open scrub country on the other side felt different than it had going in, wider, colder, the kind of open space that felt exposed rather than free. She moved southeast the long way back, avoiding the routes she'd used coming in on the theory that anything she'd done twice was a pattern, and patterns were findable. She was perhaps 40 minutes from the point where she expected to meet Calloway and Aldridge at Decker's fence line when she heard something that stopped her completely. A rider, moving parallel to her course to the west. Not fast, not urgent, just moving. Could be nothing. Could be a ranch hand with legitimate business. Could be someone who'd been positioned to watch the approaches. She changed direction without breaking stride, angling east toward rougher ground that would be harder to follow on horseback. The rider, whoever it was, continued parallel for another few minutes, and then the sound diminished. Either they'd gone a different direction or the terrain had swallowed the hoofbeats. She reached the fence line at what she judged to be close to midnight, her legs aching from the extended rough country crossing and her palms still stinging from the limestone scrape. Calloway was there with Tom Aldridge. They were standing with their horses in the shadow of a large scrub oak that put them out of the moonlight. And when she came through the fence gap, they both moved toward her with the specific controlled urgency of men who'd been waiting and trying not to imagine what they might be waiting for. "You're late," Calloway said. I know. She opened the satchel and pulled out the notebook. Her hand was shaking slightly from the cold or the adrenaline or both, and she was aware of it as a physical fact without being particularly embarrassed by it. Shaking hands were a reasonable response to a reasonable situation. I have more than I thought I'd have, and something's happened. Someone cleared a location at the crossing, removed records. They may have been tipped off about something. Tipped off about what? Aldridge said. I don't know yet. It could be precautionary, but it means we're moving faster than I planned. She looked at Calloway. Holloway was there, on the ridgeline. I saw him. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. You're certain, Calloway said, certain enough to write it down. She held up the notebook. His build, his hat, his location. I can't give you a sworn affidavit that it was him, but I can give you a documented contemporaneous observation that will be very difficult to explain away in context with everything else I have. Aldridge said something under his breath that she didn't catch. His expression in the moonlight was the specific expression of a man who'd suspected something for a long time and still found the confirmation worse than the suspicion. The letters went out this morning? She asked. Martha posted them on the first stage, Aldridge said. Both of them. Good. She looked at Calloway. I need you to take these. She held out the notebook. All of it. The sketches, the brand descriptions, the ledger numbers I copied, the names, everything. I need you to ride for the territorial marshal tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. You take Tom with you, and you don't stop in Coldwater for anything. Calloway looked at her, then at the notebook in her hand. He took it. And you? He said. She'd known this was coming. She'd worked through it on the walk back, in the cold and the dark, with the sound of that parallel rider still in her ears. There's one more thing I need, she said. The holding location, wherever they're keeping the animals before moving them through the corridor. It has to be north of the entry, within a day's drive. If I can find it and document it, that's the physical evidence that ties everything else together. The ledger numbers mean more if there are matching animals at a location that can be rated. Marin, Calloway's voice had changed register slightly. You just said they may be cleaning up. Going back in. I'm not going back in the corridor. I'm going to circle north of Decker's fence line and look for recent cattle activity in the unregistered country. It's a different approach from a different direction. I can be in and out before first light and meet you at the Aldridge place by morning. That's not a good plan, he said. I know it's not a good plan. It's the plan I have. She met his eyes. You need to go. The longer those letters sit without follow-up material, the easier it is for someone to call them unfounded. You get what I've given you to the marshal, and you don't wait for me. I'll find my own way out. A silence. Tom Aldridge was looking between them, the way a man looked when he recognized he was not part of the decision being made. If you're not at Aldridge's by dawn, Calloway said, I'm coming back. If I'm not at Aldridge's by dawn, coming back won't do either of us much good, she said. Go. He looked at her for a long moment, the creekwater eyes in the moonlight. Then he turned to his horse, and Tom Aldridge turned to his, and Marin watched them go south along the fence line until they were out of sight in the scrub. The night was quiet. The scrub country around her was still and cold. Her satchel was lighter now without the notebook, and her palm ached where she'd scraped it on the limestone, and somewhere to the north of her, in the unregistered country above Decker's fence line, there was something she hadn't found yet. She turned and walked north. She did not allow herself to think about whether this was wise. Wisdom, she'd found, was often another word for stopping before you were done. She'd been stopping before she was done her entire life, in every room and at every table where her presence had been tolerated rather than invited. And she was tired of it in a way that went bone deep. She wasn't brave. She was just more tired of being careful than she was afraid of what lay ahead. The limestone country accepted her back into its shadow, and she kept moving, 1 foot at a time, the cold air sharp in her lungs, the scrape on her palm, a small, honest ache that kept her present and grounded and exactly where she was. The holding location was exactly where the terrain logic said it would be. She found it an hour before the sky started changing color in the east. A natural bowl in the limestone country north of the corridor entry, tucked behind a secondary ridge that made it invisible from any of the approaches a person would naturally take to that area. Someone had improved it modestly, a low fence of rough-cut timber on the open southern side, a water trough fed by a hand-dug channel from a seep spring in the rock face, and a lean-to structure against the north wall of the bowl that provided shelter for whoever was managing the animals held there. There were cattle in it. 17 head, she counted, standing quiet in the cold pre-dawn dark. Close enough to the fence that she could see the brands by the faint light that was beginning, barely, to separate the sky from the ridgeline. She documented everything. Every animal she could get a clear look at. Brand descriptions. The same altered construction she'd observed in the corridor. The base mark worked over with a precision that required time and a calm hand, and probably more than one attempt to get right. Physical descriptions of the animals themselves, colorings, markings, ear notches. The kind of individual detail that, matched against a rancher's records of specific animals lost, would be very hard to argue against in front of a territorial court. She also documented the structure, measured it by pacing, roughly 30 feet on the long side, noted the construction quality, the water source, the evidence of regular habitation. Boot prints near the lean-to, a fire scar with ash that was days old, not weeks. A length of rope coiled on a fence post with a working man's knot that spoke of someone who used it regularly. She noted the coil of rope and the knot specifically, because details like that were the kind of thing that later, in a hearing room, reminded people that this was a real place where real people had done real things over a long period of time. Abstract corruption was easy to dismiss. A rope on a fence post with a particular knot was not. She was finishing the last of her notes, crouched at the corner of the lean-to where the shadows were deepest, when she heard the lean-to door. It opened outward, which she hadn't anticipated. She'd assumed the structure was empty, no light inside, no sound. But the door swung open and a man came out, moving with the stiff, groping urgency of someone who'd been asleep and had a pressing reason to be vertical. And he went 4 steps to the left and attended to the reason without looking around at all. She did not move. She pressed against the lean-to wall, which was now directly beside her rather than behind her, and she did not breathe more than she absolutely had to, and she held the notebook against her chest to stop its slight rattle. The man finished, turned back toward the door, and then stopped. He'd seen something. Not her. He was looking at the cattle, not the corner where she was standing, but he'd noticed something about the animals that had made him pause, and she could see him looking more carefully, counting maybe, or checking something he'd checked before going to sleep and finding it different. She had moved along the fence line to get her counts. She'd disturbed the cattle, not badly, but enough that they'd shifted position. An experienced handler would notice. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said, to no one visible, "Carver." A pause. Then from inside the lean-to, muffled by the wall she was pressed against, "What?" "Come look at this." Carver. The name registered immediately. Nora Vass's description. A drover who'd worked the Dunmore acquisition briefly and left suddenly, who Nora thought had seen something that made him want distance from the valley. Apparently he hadn't gotten far enough. The door opened again, and a second man came out, younger than the first, with the specific wariness of someone who's startled easily. He looked at the cattle. "They moved," the first man said. "They do that," Carver said. "They're cattle. They were bunched on the south side when I checked at midnight. Now they're spread." A silence. "Something came through," Carver said quietly. His voice had changed. "An animal, maybe. There aren't animals up here that move cattle around without making noise." Another silence. Marin measured it and didn't like what it measured. "Check the perimeter," the first man said. She moved before Carver turned around. Not running. Running made noise and committed her to a direction. She moved in the controlled, fast way she'd moved on the ridge. Weight forward, steps placed with intention, heading for the gap in the timber fence on the eastern side of the bowl, the one she'd noted on the way in as the most direct exit to the open country that led eventually back toward Decker's fence line. She heard Carver behind her, not close, not yet. He hadn't seen her. He was checking the perimeter methodically, starting from the other side. She went through the fence gap and immediately dropped to the right, into the shadow of the ridge wall, and crouched motionless. Carver came around the fence line 12 seconds later, moving with the lantern he'd lit from somewhere inside the lean-to. The light swept across the ground she'd just crossed. She was in the shadow and the lantern was not close enough to reach her, but the boot prints she'd left in the softer soil near the gap were visible, and Carver stopped and looked at them. She watched his face in the lantern's upward light. He was young, the same mid-20s she'd estimated in the corridor the night before. He had the look of someone who'd made a series of decisions he hadn't fully thought through and was now living in their consequences.
He looked at the boot prints and then looked in the direction they led, which was the direction she'd come from, and then he looked in the other direction where she'd actually gone. He looked uncertain. The first man called from inside the bowl. "Anything?" Carver opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he said, "Deer sign. We're fine." He went back inside. She stayed in the shadow for 10 full minutes, not moving. Then she turned east and walked out of the limestone country as quickly as she could without making the kind of noise that carried. She didn't understand why Carver had lied for her. She didn't try to understand it in the moment. Understanding it was a task for later, when she was somewhere that afforded the luxury of thinking rather than moving. What she understood in the moment was that she'd been given a margin she hadn't earned, and she intended to use every inch of it. She reached the Aldridge place at 40 minutes past sunrise, which was later than she'd told Calloway and earlier than she'd privately feared. Mrs. Aldridge opened the door before Marin had finished knocking, which meant she'd been watching from the window, which meant she'd been told to watch. She put Marin inside by the fire without saying much. She was that kind of woman, the kind who understood that certain situations called for warmth and coffee and silence rather than questions. And Marin sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup and felt the cold work its way out of her joints in degrees. Calloway arrived 20 minutes later. He came in through the back and he looked at her with an expression she wasn't entirely sure how to categorize. Relief was part of it, and something more controlled underneath that she didn't examine closely. "You made it," he said. "I said I would." "You said you'd be here by dawn." "I was close." He sat down across from her. Tom Aldridge came in behind him, and they both looked at the fresh pages she'd added to the second notebook, the one she'd kept in reserve in the satchel. The holding location documentation, the animal counts, the brand descriptions, the lean-to measurements, the details of the rope and the fire scar and the water channel. 17 head, Calloway said. "At minimum, that's what I could observe clearly. There may be more in the far end of the bowl that I didn't get a count on. Combined with what I already have." He looked at Aldridge. "It's enough," Aldridge said. He said it simply, like a man setting something heavy down. "The marshal," Marin said. "Did you reach him before you came back?" "Deputy Marshal Hagen is in Hartwell," Calloway said. "We rode there last night. He read everything. He's a careful man. He asked questions for 2 hours." A pause. At the end of it, he said he was sending riders to the Capitol this morning for backup and warrants, and that he'd be in Coldwater Creek with a full party by this afternoon. "How many men?" 6 deputies plus himself. He said he'd been watching the land transfer pattern in this valley for 2 years and had been waiting for something he could take to a judge. Calloway looked at the notebook. "You gave him something he could take to a judge." "We gave him something," she said. "Marin, you went into that corridor alone and came out with enough documentation to arrest 6 men." He met her eyes across the table. "That's not a collective achievement." She looked at the fire. She was too tired to argue about credit and too aware of how the cold had settled into her back to hold herself at full attention. But something in what he'd said snagged at her. The word arrest. The translation of all those careful pages of notes into something that happened in the real world to real people. "Holloway," she said. "You told Hagen about Holloway." "I told him everything that was in the notebook, including the ridgeline observation." He paused. He was not surprised about Holloway. He was angry, but not surprised. She thought about that. A deputy marshal who'd been watching this valley for 2 years and hadn't been surprised by the sheriff's name on a list. That was its own kind of statement about what could be known and yet not acted upon in the absence of something concrete enough to hold. "Hector Vance," she said suddenly. "Your foreman. What about him?" "You trust him. You said 12 years. She looked at Calloway. "Is there any chance he knew about the boot? About the note being placed in it before it went to Hartwell?" A silence. It was the kind of silence that meant someone was doing honest accounting with an uncomfortable possibility. "He handled the boot," Calloway said slowly. "He's the one who took it to the shop in Hartwell. The person who placed the note knew your routine well enough to know the boot was going to Hartwell, knew which shop it was going to, and either had a contact in that shop or had access to it." She kept her voice neutral, not an accusation, a construction problem. "Is it possible that Hector Vance is the person who placed the note?" The silence stretched longer this time. "He could have placed it before he took it,"
Calloway said carefully, rather than having a contact in the Hartwell shop, which would mean he's not working against you. He's working to warn you in the most indirect way available to him, because every direct channel is compromised, Calloway said. Same conclusion you reached about whoever placed it. He exhaled. If Hector knew and was trying to tell me without putting himself at risk. He stopped. I need to talk to him. After, she said. After Hagen gets here. Until then, nothing that changes the behavior of anyone connected to this operation. He nodded, and she could see the effort it cost him, the restraint of a man who wanted to move and was being asked to hold still a little longer. Tom Aldridge got up and refilled the coffee, which was, under the circumstances, an act of genuine kindness. Deputy Marshal Hagen rode into Coldwater Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon with 7 men behind him, which was one more than Calloway had reported, and they came in from the east at a pace that was deliberate without being dramatic. Marin watched from the shop window. She'd gone back to the shop at Calloway's insistence, on the logic that her being anywhere else would be conspicuous, and conspicuous was no longer something they could afford. She watched Hagen pass. He was a compact, gray-haired man with the kind of face that had made and kept a lot of decisions. He didn't look at anything he didn't need to look at, which she appreciated. She went back to the workbench and picked up the bridle she'd been ignoring for 2 days. For the next 3 hours, she worked. She stitched and trimmed and finished, and outside on the main street of Coldwater Creek, things happened that she could track by sound. Raised voices at some point around 4, a sound that might have been a scuffle, a period of concentrated activity near the north end of the street where Ellis Raines had his office, and then a long, settling quiet that was different from ordinary quiet. At 6 o'clock, Calloway knocked on the front door. She let him in. He came to the bench and stood there with the specific, still quality of a man who had just watched something large come down. Raines is in custody, he said. Decker, Commissioner Fowler. A pause. Holloway. She set down the bridle. Dunmore wasn't in the valley, he continued. He's in the capital. Hagen sent a wire. They'll pick him up there. He looked at the bench, at the scattered tools, and the half-finished work. The holding location. Hagen sent 2 men north with a rider who knows that country. They found it. The animals were still there? 16 head, not 17. One must have been moved before they arrived. But 16 with altered brands that match Aldridge's registration records and 2 other ranchers we hadn't even spoken to yet. He paused. Hagen said it was the most organized evidentiary presentation he'd received from a civilian source in his career. Marin looked at the bridle in her hands. He wants to speak with you, Calloway said. Tomorrow morning. At the Marshal's temporary office. They're using the Hartwell County building on 2nd Street. All right. A silence. Carver came in, Calloway said. The drover from the holding location. He walked into the Marshal's office on his own, about an hour after the arrest started, and asked to give a statement. She looked up. He talked? He talked for 4 hours, apparently. Hagen said he'd been trying to find a way out since his 3rd week on the job. He'd seen too much and gotten in too deep and couldn't figure out how to leave without someone deciding he was a liability. A beat. He said someone had been through the holding location in the pre-dawn hours, and he'd found boot prints he hadn't reported. She was quiet. He said he decided if someone had been in there documenting rather than disrupting, they probably had a reason, and he was going to give the evidence time to matter before he said anything. Calloway looked at her steadily. He probably saved your life, not reporting those prints. I know, she said. I didn't understand why at the time. He said you moved quiet as a cat, and he almost didn't see you at all, but he saw the prints. She thought about the young man's face in the lantern light, the uncertainty in it, the open mouth that had closed before saying anything, the decision that had cost him nothing in the moment and everything in every direction. It had left him exposed on both sides, the man he'd lied to and whatever was coming from the direction of those boot prints. He made a hard call, she said. Yes. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Hagen thinks he'll be treated as a cooperative witness. His testimony is significant. He can identify men, locations, dates of operation going back 14 months. She nodded. The bridle was still in her hands, and she set it down because she couldn't remember what she'd been doing with it. The man who cleared the box at the crossing, she said. Do they know who that was? Fowler's hired man. He's in custody. Picked up at Fowler's ranch this afternoon. Calloway leaned against the bench edge. Fowler, when they arrested him, said he'd had a report from someone that there was movement in the corridor last night. Someone had seen a light they shouldn't have seen, apparently. Your tinderbox. I didn't light it. The opening of it, maybe. Metal catches the moonlight. He shrugged slightly. Didn't matter in the end. Whatever they'd cleaned from the box, you'd already copied. She thought about that. The tin box and its contents copied into her notebook by cold lantern light. The originals were placed precisely so they'd appear undisturbed. The box now empty or confiscated, either way no longer relevant, because the numbers and names and notation marks existed in her handwriting in a notebook that was currently in the custody of a territorial deputy marshal. What about Asa Pruitt, she said, at the land office. Hagen knows him, said Pruitt had been building a parallel file on Dunmore's acquisition pattern for over a year, had been waiting for something to anchor it to an active operation rather than just a suspicious pattern. Calloway looked at her with something direct and unguarded in his face. Your letter was, apparently, the thing he'd been waiting for. She took that in. She thought about Rowan sitting at the window in the shops last years, watching the street go by, noting things in the way of a man who'd spent a working life paying attention to what others didn't bother to observe. She thought about the notebook in the chest under the cot, open to the page about the drainage way with its surprising amount of cattle sign. She thought about 20 years of that valley not adding up quite right, a quiet discrepancy that everyone had lived inside of and nobody had named. She hadn't named it either until a boot came through her door with a secret in its heel. Nora Vass, she said, because Hagen's going to speak with her tomorrow, same as you, and Aldridge. He straightened up from the bench edge. The animals from the holding location will be held at the territorial facility in Hartwell while the registrations are matched. Aldridge should get most of his back, and there are 2 other ranchers with plausible claims. The Kellerman property, she said, what Dunmore bought. That's a more complicated legal matter. Hagen said there's a process for properties acquired under fraudulent circumstances. It'll take time. He paused. But it's a process that exists, which it wouldn't be without what you've built. She looked at the workbench, the scattered tools, the unfinished bridle, the small leather pouch, with the original note from the boot still inside it. She'd been carrying that note for 6 days. It felt longer. The note, she said, the original. Hagen will want it. He asked for it, yes. When you come in tomorrow. She reached into the pouch and took it out, set it on the bench, looked at it. The small, cramped handwriting, the light pencil impression. Someone scared, trying to tell someone something through the most indirect channel they could find. Did they identify who wrote it? Not yet. Hagen thinks it may have been the man who ran the Hartwell shop. He's apparently disappeared in the last 2 days, which is its own kind of answer. Calloway looked at the note. Whoever it was, they took a significant risk. They were probably involved, she said, peripherally, enough to know what was happening and to understand they were in it whether they wanted to be or not. The note was an exit of sorts, a way of doing something without doing something. Not unlike filing a note in a chest and hoping someone found it eventually. She looked at him. He was looking at the note, not at her, but she could see from the angle of his jaw that he knew what he'd said and had meant it. Rowan would have done something with what he knew, she said quietly, if anyone had ever asked him. I know. Nobody asked. I know that too. A long silence. The shop held it without strain, the way a good piece of work held stress. Not by being rigid, but by being sound throughout. Hector Vance, she said. Did you talk to him? Calloway was quiet for a moment. I did. After the arrests. Before I came here. Another pause. He placed the note. She had thought so, but hearing it confirmed settled something. He'd known for about 2 months, Calloway said. One of Dunmore's men approached him last spring, asked him to start providing information about the ranch's operations, count schedules, movement patterns, in exchange for money and the assurance that Hawk Ridge wouldn't be targeted the way the smaller outfits had been. He stopped. Hector said no, but in saying no he understood what he was looking at, and he started paying attention differently. And couldn't go to you directly. He said he didn't know who was watching. He'd seen what happened to the Kellerman foreman when he'd started asking questions. The man left the valley inside a week, under what Hector described as persuasive circumstances. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd come to associate with him working through something he found difficult. He found the boot going to Hartwell. He knew the shop. He knew the shop owner was someone who'd been quietly pressured to look the other way and might be reachable. He wrote the note and hit it on the principle that it would either go nowhere or end up somewhere useful. "It ended up here," she said. "It ended up with you." He looked at her directly, which turned out to be the most useful place it could have gone. She didn't say anything to that. She wasn't sure what there was to say. The note had come to her by accident and by geography and by the ordinary contingency of a boot needing repair, and she had done something with it because she'd been raised by a man who noticed things and because she was tired of filing things away that deserved to be said out loud. That wasn't heroism. That was just the accumulated weight of a long patience reaching its limit. "Is Hector all right?" she asked. "He's shaken. He's been carrying it for 2 months alone." Calloway's voice had something careful in it. "I told him he should have come to me. And he said he didn't know if he could trust me, not because of anything I'd done, because he didn't know who'd gotten to whom. And in that situation, you don't trust anyone until you have no other option." A pause. "He wasn't wrong to be careful." "No," she said. "He wasn't." The shop was getting dark. She'd been working by diminishing light without noticing, the October evening coming down faster than she'd tracked, and she reached over and lit the lamp on the bench more from habit than from thought. The warm circle of light spread across the tools and the leather and the unfinished bridle and the small note on the bench between them. Outside, Coldwater Creek was doing something unusual for that hour. It was loud. Not with the ordinary sounds of an evening, the saloon and the wagons and the dogs, but with voices, multiple voices. The specific energetic sound of a town that had been handed a piece of news too large to absorb quietly. She'd heard that sound once before, years ago, when a fire had taken the mill and the whole town had come out into the street to stand together in the face of a shared disaster. This was different in quality but similar in volume, the sound of people finding out that something they'd been living inside of wasn't what they'd thought. "Dunmore's name will be in the warrant," Calloway said. "People will be reading it by morning." "And Holloway's, bet." "And Holloway's, Dad's." He said it with a flatness that suggested he'd been thinking about that specific part for the better part of the afternoon. "A lot of people in this town brought things to Holloway and got nothing, or got what they thought was nothing. Some of them will be angry," she said, "at him, but also at themselves, for not pushing harder. Maybe," he looked at her, "or maybe they'll be grateful that someone pushed hard enough for all of them." She picked up the bridle and looked at the unfinished section. She needed another hour of work on it, maybe less. She was very tired in the specific, deep way of someone who'd been running on urgency for days and was only now feeling the weight of what had been carrying her. "Go home, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Rhett," he said. She looked up. "If we're past the point where you're taking my boot orders, I think we're past the point where you call me Mr. Calloway." She considered that. It was a reasonable position, stated plainly, without affectation. She found she didn't have an argument against it. "Go home, Rhett," she said. Something in his face did the thing that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. He picked up his hat from the corner of the bench where he'd set it, and he looked at the note one more time, and then he went to the door. "Hagen, tomorrow morning, 2nd Street." "I'll be there," she said. The bell above the door chimed once. The footsteps on the steps went down and away, and the sounds of the street swallowed them, and Marin sat alone at the workbench with the lamp burning warm and the bridle in her hands. She worked. An hour, as she'd estimated, though it ran a little longer because she was meticulous in the ways she'd always been meticulous and tired in ways she hadn't been before. The town outside gradually settled, the voices dropping, the unusual energy dissipating into the ordinary evening sounds as people went inside to sit with what they'd learned. At some point while she was working, she became aware that she wasn't bracing anymore. It was a physical thing, the absence of it. The way you only noticed you'd been holding tension in your shoulders when it finally went. She'd been carrying something tight in her chest for days, maybe longer. A held posture of waiting and watching and not quite trusting the ground under her feet. And it was releasing now in the slow, unannounced way that things released when the reason for holding them had passed. She set the bridle down at 10 o'clock and looked at the finished work. It was good. Tight stitch line, the leather properly conditioned, the hardware set correctly and firmly. A thing made well, that would last. She looked at Rowan's empty chair by the front window. She thought about what he would have said. She wasn't sure exactly. Rowan hadn't been a man of large declarations, and she didn't want to put words in the mouth of a person she loved who was no longer there to object. But she thought he would have had something dry and specific to say about a leather worker who'd accidentally taken apart an entire criminal operation while fixing a boot heel, and whatever it was, it would have made her laugh. She missed him the way she'd been missing him since October began. Not acutely, not in the sudden shock way of new grief, but steadily, the way you felt the absence of a sound you'd been so accustomed to hearing, that silence where it used to be, had its own particular weight. She took the note from the bench and put it back in the leather pouch. Tomorrow she'd hand it to Hagen. Tonight, it could stay where it had been. She blew out the lamp and went to the back room and lay down on the cot, still dressed for the second night in a row, and outside the town settled into proper quiet. And for the first time in a week, she fell asleep before she'd finished deciding to. She was at the marshal's temporary office on 2nd Street by 8 in the morning, 20 minutes before Hagen had asked her to arrive, because she was constitutionally incapable of being late to anything, and because she'd been awake since 5 anyway, lying on the cot listening to the town begin its day with a quality that felt different from the days preceding it. Not transformed. Nothing as simple as that. Just different in the specific way that a room felt different after furniture that had always been wrong got moved to where it belonged. Coldwater Creek was the same town it had been a week ago, with the same street and the same buildings and most of the same people, but something had shifted in the arrangement of things, and even the early morning sounds carried it. Hagen was already there when she arrived, which answered something she'd been wondering about the man. He was the kind of person who showed up early to everything, which was either a professional habit or a personal one, and probably both. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected. It was a small thing, a courtesy that people extended to some women and not to others, according to rules she'd never fully decoded, and she was aware of it without being entirely sure what to do with it. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "thank you for coming." "Of course." He gestured to a chair across the desk from his own, and she sat, and he sat, and he put his hands flat on the desk in the way of a man who used his hands to think and had trained himself to hold them still during formal conversations. "I've read everything Mr. Calloway brought me," he said, "twice. And I've now spoken with the individuals in custody, reviewed the physical evidence from the holding location, and begun matching the registered brand records against what my men documented there." He paused. "I want to be direct with you. What you assembled is not the work of someone who got lucky. It's the work of someone who thinks carefully and documents precisely and knew exactly what they were doing." "I wasn't sure I knew what I was doing," she said honestly. "I knew what I was looking at." "That's the same thing, in my experience." He reached into the file on his desk and produced the original note. She'd given it to Calloway the night before to bring in, not wanting to carry it through the streets herself when it was no longer necessary. This was the beginning of it. Yes, the man who ran the Hartwell shop, a man named Petrie. We located him this morning. He'd been in a boarding house in the next county, waiting to see how things fell. Hagen set the note down carefully. "He's agreed to give a full statement. He was approached by one of Dunmore's associates 14 months ago and pressured into providing access to boots and tack brought in for repair from the Valley ranches, mainly for monitoring, knowing what was being used, what was being replaced, who was spending money on their equipment, which was a rough indicator of financial health." A pause. When Calloway's boot came in and Petrie recognized it, he understood the opportunity. He placed the note himself. He said he'd been looking for a way to communicate with someone outside the network for months. She thought about that. Petrie, in a Hartwell shop, making a decision in the few minutes between receiving a famous rancher's boot and releasing it, understanding that the construction was going to require a heel replacement and that a heel replacement was a moment of opening, a moment when the boot came apart and someone knowledgeable would look inside. He gambled on whoever opened the boot knowing what to do with it, she said. He gambled on a leather worker, Hagen said, someone who understood construction well enough to recognize the deliberate tamper. He said if it had been someone who'd just replaced the heel without looking closely, the note would have been destroyed in the process, and that would have been the end of it. He looked at her. He got luckier than he deserved to, but the note got where it needed to go. To me, she said. To you.
She looked at the note on the desk. The small, cramped handwriting, the light pencil that had tried to leave as little impression as possible, and it ended up mattering more than anyone who wrote it had expected. "What happens to Petrie?" she asked. "Cooperative witness. Same as Carver." Hagen squared the papers in front of him in the precise way of a man who used physical order to manage complexity. Carver's testimony is particularly significant. He was present at the holding location on 8 separate occasions over the past 5 months. He can identify every man who used it, confirm the alteration process, and place Dunmore's senior associate, a man named Briggs, who we arrested in the Capitol yesterday morning alongside Dunmore, at the location on 3 specific dates. Dunmore's in custody since yesterday afternoon. Hagen said it with a flatness that contained more satisfaction than his expression showed. He attempted to leave the Capitol by the northern stage. We'd wired ahead. She thought about Victor Dunmore, a man she'd never met, who had built a system elegant enough to run for 20 years without producing anything that looked like evidence from the outside. A land speculator who understood that you didn't have to steal land directly when you could destabilize the people who owned it, slowly and methodically, until they sold it to you for what they could get. It was a patient crime. It required the kind of patience that most people couldn't sustain because most people needed to see their results. She respected the patience even while she found the use of it contemptible. Those were not contradictory positions. "Holloway," she said. Hagen was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't said much. His attorney arrived from Hartwell this morning." Another pause. "He was involved for 6 years, Raines for 9, Decker for the full 20. Decker's father was part of the original arrangement, and Harlan continued it when he inherited the ranch. It's an unusual thing, a crime you inherit." She thought about Harlan Decker, a man she knew only as a name on a fence line on a map, the son of a man who'd built something corrupt and passed it to his child along with the land and the cattle and everything else that fathers pass to sons, whether the sons were ready for it or not. She didn't feel sorry for him. He'd made choices, continued a thing he could have stopped, but she understood that people were more complicated than their worst decisions. And that understanding was not the same as forgiveness. "The land," she said, "the Kellerman property and the others, Dunmore's acquisitions. The territorial attorney is reviewing the transfer records. The standard for recovering property obtained through demonstrable fraud is achievable if the original owners, or their heirs, in cases where the owners have since passed on, can establish the coercive circumstances." He looked at her steadily. "It will take time. These things always do. But it's not impossible, and a year ago it would have been." A beat. "Because a year ago, there wasn't a case." She nodded. "There's one more thing I want to address." Hagen folded his hands. "Your ridgeline observation of Sheriff Holloway. You were direct in your notes about the conditions, the distance, the light, the duration. You didn't overclaim." "I saw what I saw. I couldn't certify more than that." "That restraint is exactly what makes it useful in a formal proceeding," he said. "A witness who says they're certain of everything is usually certain of less than they claim. A witness who accurately describes the limits of their observation is someone a court can rely on." He paused. "You'll likely be asked to give formal testimony, possibly in the Capitol if the proceedings are elevated to that jurisdiction, which, given the scope of what Dunmore was running, seems probable." "I understand." "Is that something you're willing to do?" She thought about it genuinely, not as a formality. Testifying in a formal proceeding meant being visible in a way that was different from the visibility of the past week. It meant putting her name on a public record, standing in a room and saying aloud what she had seen and how she had seen it, in front of people who would scrutinize it and some of whom would try to find the place where it came apart. It meant being looked at. She had spent her entire adult life preferring not to be looked at. That preference had served her in certain ways. She'd moved through the world without friction, gathered information without resistance, existed in spaces where useful things could be observed precisely because no one bothered to watch her doing it. But preference and necessity were different things, and the preference had its cost. It had cost her a long time of staying silent about things that deserved to be spoken. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." Hagen nodded once. He extended his hand across the desk and she shook it, and that was the end of the formal part of the meeting.
The part that wasn't formal came afterward, in the way that mattered more. It started small, the way the significant things often did. Tom Aldridge came to the shop that afternoon to collect the traces she'd repaired. They'd been sitting finished on the shelf for days now, the ordinary work that had kept going regardless of everything else. And he stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, as if he needed to gather something. "Martha wants to know if you'll come to supper Saturday," he said. "The family." She looked at him. It was a plain invitation, nothing elaborate about it, but Tom Aldridge was not a man who issued plain invitations casually. He said things when he meant them and didn't say them when he didn't, which she'd observed in their conversations and found reliable. "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, took the traces, and paid her, and on his way out he paused again and said without turning around, "Rowan would have been something to see this week." He left before she had to respond to that, which was considerate of him. Nora Vass came 2 days later. She didn't have a repair order. She came simply to talk, and she sat in the customer's chair with her hands in her lap and said, "Hagen told me what you did. The night in the corridor. The holding location." "We all did parts of it," Marin said. "You did the part nobody else could have done." Nora said it without flourish, as a factual statement. "Because nobody else would have been invisible enough to do it." She paused. "I've been thinking about that. About what it costs, being that invisible. For that long." Marin set down the tool she'd been holding. "It wasn't entirely a cost." "No," Nora said. "But it wasn't nothing either." They sat with that for a moment. Two women in a shop at the end of a main street, and there was something honest and unhurried in the silence that Marin didn't try to fill. "The animals I lost," Nora said finally. "Two of them were identified at the holding location. Hagen's office will have them back to me within the month." She paused. "I've been ranching here for 4 years thinking the valley was simply hard, thinking I was losing animals to drift in hard winters and my own inexperience." A long exhale. "It wasn't that." "No." "It makes me angry," Nora said. "In a way I'm not entirely sure what to do with." "That seems reasonable," Marin said. "Does it get smaller, the anger?" Marin thought about that honestly. She thought about her own anger, which she'd carried for years in a form she hadn't always recognized as anger because it had been so quiet. The specific low heat of a person who had been unseen for so long that the unseen had become its own kind of wrong. She thought about whether documenting a criminal operation from inside a rock shadow at midnight had made that anger smaller or simply given it somewhere to go. "I think it changes shape," she said finally. "I don't know that it gets smaller." Nora looked at her and then nodded, and the nod had a quality of genuine reception to it, the nod of someone who'd rather have the honest answer than the comfortable one. They talked for another hour about the valley and the cases and the slow practical business of what came next. And when Nora left, she said she'd be in touch about having Marin look at a saddle that had been giving her rider trouble. It was a small thing, a work thing, and it was also not only that. Walkwood. Hector Vance came on a Thursday. He came without Calloway, which she understood as deliberate. There were things a man needed to say without his employer present, especially when some of what needed saying touched on the employer. He was a broad, quiet man in his mid-40s with weathered hands and the careful eyes of someone who'd spent years reading terrain and reading people and had learned to hold what he saw without reacting visibly. He sat in the customer's chair and he looked at the bench and he said, "I should have found a better way." She waited. "The note was the best I could think of, but it was slow and indirect and there was no guarantee it got anywhere useful." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what might have happened if it hadn't, if the boot had gone to someone who didn't look closely, if Calloway had picked it up and the heel had held another month before coming apart. Then we'd still be where we were," she said. "The operation would still be running. And I'd still be the only person who knew about it and was too scared to say it out loud." He said it flatly, without self-pity, in the way of someone doing accurate accounting. "That's not something I'm comfortable with. You were in an impossible position." "I was in a position I let myself stay in longer than I should have." He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "I'm not looking for you to absolve me. I'm just saying it out loud to someone who was part of what fixed it." She thought about what to say. She thought about the long chain of decisions that had gotten them to this point. Petrie placing a note in a boot, Hector placing that note in a heel, the boot coming to her shop by the simple geography of proximity, her choosing to open the construction rather than replace the heel without looking. Any link in that chain going differently, and the outcome changes. That was not a comforting thought exactly, but it was an honest one. You made the decision that mattered when you had it, she said. The rest is what it is. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Calloway told me what you did. In the corridor. The holding location. He paused. He said you went back in alone after sending them out with the evidence. Said you did it because you needed the physical location to anchor the rest. I did need it. He said he's never met anyone who thought that clearly under that kind of pressure. Another pause, shorter. I've worked for Calloway for 12 years. He doesn't say things like that about people. She looked at the bench. He's a good judge of what matters, she said, which was what she meant and less than what she could have said, and she left it there. Hector got up to go, and at the door he stopped and said, Calloway's going to want your opinion on the new saddle order. He told me to tell you. Said his current rig doesn't fit the horse right, and it's been a problem for 2 seasons. He said it in the specific dry tone of a man relaying information that contained more than the information. He'll be in. She said she'd be here. The hearing in the Capitol happened in late November, when the valley had fully committed to winter and the passes were uncomfortable but passable for a rider who knew the routes. Marin testified on a Tuesday. She wore her best dress, the one she'd put on once by mistake for a supper she hadn't been meant to attend, and she sat in the chair that was provided for witnesses, and she answered the questions she was asked in the precise, limited way that she'd answered questions her whole professional life. This is what I observed. This is when I observed it. This is what I concluded, and why. And here's the explicit boundary between observation and inference. The attorney for Dunmore's defense was a capable man from the Capitol who had clearly expected a leather worker from a frontier town to be a weak witness and had prepared accordingly. He was not unkind exactly, but there was a particular quality to his initial questions, a slight over-articulation, a tendency to rephrase simple things as if clarifying for someone who might not follow. That told her he'd formed an opinion of her before she'd opened her mouth. She answered everything clearly. She did not fill silences that weren't hers to fill. When he tried to suggest that her observations in the corridor had been limited by darkness and distance, she agreed with him precisely. Yes, the light was poor and the distance was approximately 40 yards. And then laid out, detail by detail, exactly what 40 yards in poor light had allowed her to observe with specificity and why. The altered brands, which she described in construction terms so exact that the court recorder had to ask her to slow down. The ledger entries she'd memorized and copied, the conversation fragment she'd heard at the crossing, the specific way Holloway had stood on that ridgeline, the posture, the hat, the particular way he'd turned his head, that she could describe because she'd been watching people's physical details her entire working life, and her memory for them was accurate, and she knew it was accurate because it had never failed her on a work order, and she'd never had an unsatisfied customer. The defense attorney stopped rephrasing things for simplicity around the third question. Dunmore was convicted on 14 counts, Holloway on 6. Raines, Decker, Fowler all entered agreements before their cases went to full proceedings, which the territorial attorney said was a direct consequence of the documentary evidence being too complete to argue against effectively. She learned all of this in letters back in Coldwater Creek because she'd come home the day after her testimony. There was work to do. There was always work to do. It was Rhett Calloway who told her about the Kellerman property. He came in for the saddle fitting in the first week of December, when the cold had settled into the valley with the serious intention of staying, and he stood at the bench while she examined the rig and identified the 3 places where the fit was off and explained what she was going to do about each of them, and he watched her work with the quality of attention she'd come to associate with him. Not passive, not performative, just genuinely present in the way of someone who found the thing being done worth watching. When she finished the assessment and they'd agreed on the work and the price, he didn't leave immediately. The territorial attorney filed the recovery claim for the Kellerman property last week, he said. Paul Kellerman's son. He's been working a ranch in the next territory since his father sold out. He's coming back. She set down the measuring cord. How long will the recovery take? Year, maybe more. These things drag. He leaned against the bench edge. But Asa Pruitt at the land office has been assigned to the case, which Hagen said means it'll be handled properly. A pause.
Pruitt sent a letter to Hagen, apparently. Said the documentation you provided gave him the first solid anchor he'd had in 2 years of watching that acquisition pattern. He wanted it noted. He's doing the work, she said. I just gave him something to attach it to. You keep doing that, Calloway said. Doing what? Reducing what you did to the minimum possible description of it. He said it without irritation, just as an observation. You built a case from a folded note and a scratch in a boot insole, in about a week, alone mostly, and in conditions that were not safe. He looked at her directly with those flat Creekwater eyes that she'd learned were not shallow at all. You can let it be what it was.
She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Coldwater Creek moved through its December morning. Colder and quieter than October, the street traffic reduced to people with specific purposes, no one lingering in the cold without a reason. My grandfather built his life on noticing things that other people didn't bother to look at, she said finally. He never thought of it as remarkable. It was just the way he was made. She looked at the saddle on the bench. I'm the same way. I notice things. I follow what I notice until I understand it. That's not a special quality. It's just a way of being in the world. Most people don't follow what they notice into a corridor full of cattle thieves at midnight, Calloway said. Most people have more to lose. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you have to lose? It was a genuine question, asked plainly, and she found that it required a genuine answer rather than a deflection. She thought about the cot in the back room, the chair where Rowan used to sit by the window, the bench with its tools in their places, the shop that was hers by the default of love rather than legal arrangement, the life that was sufficient in most ways and thin in others, the long habit of being unremarkable in a town that had never asked her to be anything else. Not much, she said, which turned out to be the point. He looked at her for a moment, then looked away at the window, and she could see him sitting with that answer and finding it more complicated than it sounded on the surface, which was the right response to it. Supper, he said. Saturday. Tom and Martha Aldridge, Nora Vass, Hector. I'm hosting at the ranch, he paused. I'd like you to come. She thought about the last supper invitation she'd received. Clara Finch, on the path from the cemetery, suggesting that a woman alone in a trade might do better finding work with Mrs. Aldrich. That had been 7 weeks ago. It felt like a different season in more ways than the calendar. All right, she said. The supper was loud in the way of people who'd been through something together and were still processing it. Not the formal, careful gathering she might have expected, but a table full of people who kept starting sentences and then laughing at something someone else said before finishing them, and eating too much, and talking over each other in the good-natured way of people who didn't feel the need to manage their impressions. She sat between Nora Vass and Hector Vance, and across from Tom Aldridge, who told a story about the morning of the arrest that was already becoming a story. That particular elevation that happened to real events when people needed them to be stories. When the experience became the telling of the experience and took on the shape of something with a beginning and middle and a satisfying end. She listened and occasionally corrected a detail and mostly let the story be what it was becoming, because stories were what people had instead of perfect memory, and what this table needed was not a precise record, but something they could carry forward. Calloway said relatively little during the meal. He was the kind of host who made sure things were replenished and conversations were moving and nobody was left at the edge of the table, and she noticed that the quality of attention he gave to the room, making sure every person in it felt seen and included. It was a different kind of noticing than hers, directed outward rather than inward, but it was genuine, and she recognized it as genuine. After supper, when the table had been cleared and the evening had settled into the specific ease of a fire, and people who'd eaten well and had nothing immediately demanding their attention, Nora said, I want to say something. The table quieted. Nora was not a woman who made speeches. The stillness in the room acknowledged that and waited. 4 years ago, when my husband died and I stayed on to run the ranch, every person in this valley thought I'd sell by spring, she said, including some people at this table, no offense to anyone. A slight smile. I didn't sell. But for 2 of those 4 years, someone was taking from me, steadily, carefully, just enough that I felt it without having proof of it, and I couldn't explain the gap between what the land should have produced and what it did. And I started to wonder if I was wrong about my own numbers. If the problem was me. She paused. It wasn't me. Silence. Marin figured that out, she said, along with everything else she figured out. And I just want to say that at this table, in front of people who are going to understand what I mean, thank you for not letting me be wrong about my own land. It was not the kind of thanks that required a response. Marin didn't try to give one. She just nodded once, and Nora nodded back, and that was the right amount of that. She walked back from Hawk Ridge Ranch in the cold dark, which Calloway had argued against, and she'd overruled on the grounds that it was 4 miles, and the night was clear, and she was not a woman who needed escorting through her own valley. He'd walked her to the end of the drive instead, and they'd stood there for a moment with the cold coming off the open country and the stars doing what stars did in October over flat land, which was to say, everything without restraint. "The shop," he said. "You've been there, what, 15 years?" 17. I was 7 when I came to Rowan. And you've never thought about doing anything else. "I've thought about it," she said. "I just haven't wanted anything else. The work is right. It suits me." She looked at the dark shape of the road ahead. Rowan used to say that half the misery in the world came from people doing work they weren't built for, and the other half came from people who'd found the right work but couldn't see it for what it was. "Which half were you?" "Both at different times," she said honestly. "Right now I'm in neither half, which is unusual, and I'm not taking it for granted." He was quiet for a moment. The cold pressed in around them with the serious intention of December. She could see her breath. "The valley's going to look different in spring," he said. "New sheriff. The county commissioners are in the process of appointing someone from outside who doesn't have existing relationships here. The Kellerman property recovery moving forward. 2 other ranchers who came forward after the arrests with count discrepancies that are being investigated." He paused. "It's going to take time, but it's moving." "Things move when they have something to move toward," she said. He looked at her in the particular way he'd developed over the past weeks. Not the flat, closed assessment of the man who'd walked into her shop with a damaged boot, but something more direct that he'd apparently decided she warranted. She'd gotten used to it, which was itself something she noted without quite knowing what to do with. "I'll bring the saddle in next week," he said, "when you've had time to work on the fit issues. I'll have a look at it. And the other thing," he said it carefully, "the supper, if that was something you'd want to do again." She looked at the road ahead and then at him, and she understood what was being offered and what it wasn't. Not a grand declaration, not something that needed to be resolved at the end of a cold driveway in December, just the careful extension of a possibility by someone who'd learned to be careful about where he put his weight. She thought about the kind of belonging she'd understood her whole life, borrowed and provisional and contingent on usefulness, on being the person who fixed things for people who otherwise didn't think about her. She thought about what it might mean to be somewhere not because she was useful, but because she was wanted. It was a different kind of thing. She wasn't sure she was practiced at it. "Ask me again in spring," she said, "when we're not standing in the cold making decisions." Something moved across his face, not disappointment, which she'd braced for, but something more like recognition. The look of a man who'd been told something honest rather than easy and had the good sense to receive it as the gift it was. "Spring," he said. "Spring." She walked back along the road with the cold at her back and the stars overhead, and somewhere in the dark ahead of her Coldwater Creek was settling into its night, and the shop was waiting at the end of the main street with its tools in their places and the cot in the back room and the empty chair by the window where Rowan used to sit and watch the street go by. She thought about him often in those weeks, not with the acute grief of the early days that had shifted, as grief shifted when you let it, into something quieter and more permanent, a place in her chest that was specifically his shape and would stay that shape. She didn't try to reduce it or reason past it. It was the cost of having had someone, and it was a cost she would pay without argument. She thought about what he would have made of all of it. The boot, and the note, and the cold night in the limestone country. The hearing in the Capitol, the supper at Hawk Ridge with people who'd asked her to come, not because they needed her to fix something, but because the evening was better with her in it. He would have said something dry and specific, something that made the whole thing smaller than it felt and more real at the same time. He had been that kind of person. She thought maybe she was becoming that kind of person too. She opened the shop the following Monday at 7 in the morning, the same as every Monday, and the first customer through the door was a farmer from the north end of the valley who paid late and always apologized for it with such genuine feeling that she'd never been able to hold it against him. He was holding a pair of work boots that had seen better years and was looking at her with the expression of a man who wasn't sure if what he was about to ask was reasonable. "These savable?" he said. She took the boots and looked at them properly, turning them over, pressing the sole, checking the welt, running her thumb along the stitching to feel where it had given way. The leather was tired, but not finished. The construction was sound in the places that mattered. "Yes," she said. "Give me 3 days." He looked relieved in the way people looked when something they'd thought was beyond repair turned out not to be. She set the boots on the shelf, wrote up the order in her ledger, and went back to the bench. Outside, Coldwater Creek went about its December morning. Colder than October, slower, the particular hush of a place settling into a season. She lit the lamp on the bench and picked up the bridle she'd been finishing. The one she'd put down and picked up a dozen times over the past weeks, always something more urgent, always something the work had to wait for. Nothing more urgent now. Just the bridle and the bench and the morning light coming through the front window the way it always had, falling at the same angle it had fallen her whole life, catching the dust that always gathered on the left side of the workbench no matter how many times she cleared it. She worked. She was, she thought, not the same woman who had sat at this bench 3 weeks ago, waiting for a rancher she'd never met to come back for his boot. Something had moved in her, some arrangement that had been fixed for a long time had shifted, and she was still working out the shape of it. What she was willing to say out loud now that she hadn't said before. What she was willing to want. What it meant to have been invisible for so long and to be choosing, deliberately and without anyone asking her to, not to be invisible anymore. She didn't have a clean answer to any of that. Clean answers were for other kinds of stories. What she had was the bench and the work and the particular satisfaction of a thing made well, and the letters still coming from Asa Pruitt at the land office, each one a step in the slow machinery of justice that did not move fast or clean or without friction, but moved. And the supper at the Aldridge house on Saturday, to which she had already said yes and intended to go, and the one at Hawk Ridge that she was being asked about again in spring, when the cold had passed and the valley was something other than December, and Rowan's empty chair by the window, which she had not moved and did not intend to move. The morning pressed on. The stitching went where it was supposed to go, one pull at a time, the thread drawing tight and even and holding the way good stitching held. Not because it was easy, but because the tension was right and the work was right, and the person doing it knew what they were doing. She had always known what she was doing. She had just for a long time done it alone. The bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up immediately. She was at a point in the stitch line that required her full attention, and the customer could wait 4 seconds for the sake of getting it right. 4 seconds later, she looked up. The shop was full of ordinary morning light, and the work was in her hands, and outside the window, Coldwater Creek went on being itself. Imperfect and complicated and hers, in the way that a place became yours, not when someone gave it to you, but when you had done something worth doing inside it. She went back to work.